Our grade school playground was very nice and isolated. The school itself was surrounded by around 7 or 8 acres of forest. It meant that the supervisors had to be extra vigilant to make sure no kids wandered off when they weren't supposed to. Me and my 2 other friends were known for giving the supervisors fits because we loved to go right to the edge, right up against the tree line. I can remember they were always yelling at us. We never did actually go into the woods though. But I guess the average adult, whose job depended on keeping us out, it looked like they were going into the woods as soon as somebody turned their heads. Maybe it was the 3 of us that were the sole reason the school decided a chain link fence 40 feet in front of the tree line, all around the edges of the playground. It was a good thing they did, because soon after construction, a number of supervisors seemed to retire. The fence was actually the only thing corralling us. There were still 1 or 2 supervisors, but they couldn't possibly keep tabs on us all at once. Quick note, it might sound weird me referring to teachers and aides as supervisors, but it's what I call them. It made us feel more relaxed about playing at the edge of the forest, because now there's a fence to make sure we could not go further. We hoped that meant the adults would leave us alone, which it did. One recess, like any other, we were the only 3 in the back 40 of the playground. We were just being ourselves when a very strange, very unpleasant feeling came over us. I looked at my other friends, and their expressions announced that they were feeling the same thing. I wondered if it was something my parents had mentioned. I didn't understand how it worked. Food poisoning. But apparently, there's a chance that anything you ate could make you sick. And somehow, I knew that the strange shape on the other side of the fence was what was making all 3 of us feel funny. What I saw, it looked like a deer trying to be a person. It had shaggy skin that still had fur attached to it. It looked like it had been taken from a roadkill. This thing was standing on its hind legs and gently tapping the hooves of its forelegs together. A soft but hypnotic-like beat. I can vividly remember my instincts telling me to run, and I shouted to my other friends to do the same, only realizing seconds later that my shout was just a mere whisper. I looked behind me to see that one of my other friends must have heard me and taken advice. The other was still standing there, staring at this thing. I tried to yell back to him to follow us, but again, I had trouble raising my voice. We had gotten back to the school where most of the kids played in the basketball court, and even though we had just eaten and had full stomachs, both of us felt very hungry and tired all of a sudden, as if the entire energy had been sucked out of us. It's like we had just spent a whole 15-16 hours awake, instantly. The notion actually occurred to me to go inside and ask if we could have a second lunch. I was going to voice my idea. When it was time to line up, we let one of the supervisors know that our friend was still at the edge of the playground. That was the first time I'd ever seen one of the supervisors flee. They ran down there quickly, and they didn't come back for a while. It turned out that our friend had gone missing, which I didn't understand how that could happen. There were no holes or openings in the fence, but it certainly made a huge issue with all the teachers. But he was gone, and no matter how the school searched, nothing was happening. He would never turn up after that. We have no idea what happened to him. It was pretty traumatic for all of us. Much of us were close to him, and we have nothing that we could even tell anybody, because nobody would believe us. We did talk to the cops since we were his closest friends, but they merely took our statements as a joke and told us to stop fooling around. I believe they even did a full search of the forest around. They found nothing. We went on well, life moved on. Junior high, high school, college, we just learned to live with a tragedy like that. Looking back at things and how the Earth is, and how supposed reptilians exist, and other cryptids, I wouldn't be surprised if he was taken. My brother and some of his buddies were out hunting one time when they saw something they swear wasn't right. They claimed it was supernatural or something. They'd been hunting deer and had found some exciting tracks that they wanted to follow, although they couldn't quite make out what the footprints were. There were 3 of them, all fairly experienced hunters in their own right. As they followed these tracks, they noticed that these were not only animal tracks, but bipedal humanoid tracks. Thinking that they were hot on Bigfoot's trail, that's when they started to smell a really funky smell. And they were used to finding remains of animals out in the woods, victims of other hunters who hadn't cleared up their mess. But this smell they described to me was far worse. It was like death and rot, and all the worst things in the world that could have gone off at once. The one described it as garbage, like sitting out in the hot sun. One of his friends suggested they head back. No animal was worth this. They all kind of assumed at this point this was for sure Bigfoot. But my brother insisted that he wanted to kill himself at Bigfoot. He said he felt drawn to it, like it was pulling him. They heard some rustling ahead as the stench intensified. They drew back into the cover of some bushes as to not be seen and spooked. Then they saw this thing in person. The first thing he said they noticed was that this thing stood up tall, extremely tall. It did indeed have feet similar to a deer, with little cloven hooves at the end of its arms, where hands should have been, which would explain the tracks they were following. Even though this thing seemed to shapeshift almost, what they thought they were following was a Bigfoot, was indeed something else entirely. This wasn't a buck, nor was it a Bigfoot. It looked like some sort of weird mutation between the two. Its body, while looking humanoid, had a very different head and face. It almost seemed to even have small little spikes, kind of like antlers. All of them completely frozen, not exactly sure what they were seeing. My brother shot a bullet, and they all took off running, as it charged them like a barreling grizzly bear. They still have no idea what exactly it was and what they saw. My brother's only real regret was running away, and not staying to kill this thing and see it through. One day, I was staying over with some friends who lived near a huge lake, surrounded by timber. We spent most of the time in the lodge, because it was super cold, and there had even been some snow. Of course, everybody was fine, but guess who had brought the dog with them? So, even in the snow, I had to take the dog out as he needed the exercise. I didn't want him leaving any presents for my buddies. He's a big dog, and can run, and didn't seem to mind the snow at all. One of the mornings it was pretty frosty, and I was desperately hoping that he'd do what he needed to. Chase his tail for a bit, and we could finally head back for coffee. But no, he chased off and ran off into the trees. I had to run after him. It was odd though. He usually never took off like this, and was not disobedient. So of course I had to run off after him, even into the woods. I had saw him, but a smell had nearly knocked me backwards. I'm telling you, the smell was the worst thing that I've ever smelt. It was awful. It kind of smelt like a rotting carcass. But this was somehow worse. It was like that stank, but much more pungent. I literally had to cover my nose and mouth with my hand. It was like I was walking through a field of rotting deer or animals, but I couldn't see anything around me, as far as cadavers go. I kept calling for my dog. I heard him, whimpering and whining. I've only ever heard him make that noise before, when he was staying at my folks and a coyote got into the yard. What the hell was in there, but smelled like death and warmed up and was scaring the hell out of my dog. At first, when I saw the thing in there, I thought I must be hallucinating. Something to potentially do with the cold and me maybe being hungry. This creature stood looming over my dog, who by this point was cowering. I was looking at some unknown animal, some sort of sick monster. Its body was tall and skeletal. It even appeared to have bits of flesh hanging from it. It was large, and its legs bent back and hunched over. The head looked like a mix of skull and wolf and even deer. It even appeared to have horns on its head, just like a buck would. In fact, it easily looked like it could have been a 4 or 5 pointer. But the smell and rot was so bad, I actually kind of vomited in my mouth and my eyes began watering. Then, all of a sudden in that moment, my cell phone started to ring. The silence was broken, and this thing looked up at me with the most evil, intense expression I've ever seen. My dog immediately took off running as fast as it could, back towards my direction, out the other end of the woods. This thing very slowly began lumbering towards me. It was like it was on stilts and had a very hard time moving in general. I took this as an opportunity to run as fast as I could. Luckily, somehow, my dog was not only far ahead of me, but heading back towards the house. I happily chased after him and made my way back into the house after about a 5-minute sprint through the snow. I never once turned around during that pursuit to see if this thing was anywhere close to me, and I never take my dog out in that side of the area ever again. In fact, after that, even though I've gone back to visit, I will never take my dog back, and I personally will never go back to that area of the woods. I work for a local radio station as the night DJ. It suits me down to the ground, as I've always been a night owl, rather than a morning person. One of my favorite parts about the job, despite having done this now for well over 10 years, are the listener call-in sessions. Considering I broadcast through the night, when the vast majority of regular people are fast asleep, you'd be surprised by the steady growth we've seen, not only of listeners, but interaction too. Not just people who have forgotten to turn off their radio once they've fallen asleep. I guess with the number of people working shifts these days, it sort of makes sense. The call-ins though, wow. We always talk about all kinds of stuff, but the thing that always gets me, the switchboard lit up, so to speak, is like when I ask about a spooky story. Who's got one? They range from rehash of old tales to weird and wonderful, every so often and downright terrifying. Being a Brit, most of the stories tend to be ghost-related. Maybe that is just what we do best. But a few weeks ago, I received one of the most frightening and yet interesting tales of my entire career. The person calling wished to remain anonymous, but said that they had Native American heritage. They were British. Their mother was of Native American descent and had been over here studying when she'd met her father, a Brit. Although they chose to live and raise a family here in the UK, their mother had included a lot of her culture into their upbringing. Stories and traditions and legends, dating back centuries of her own people. One of the stories that she had relayed to them was about those that are called skinwalkers. Being a Brit, although they embraced their mother's heritage, because they were literally the only child in their school and community with any sort of links to America, they were simply just stories. Stories which were fascinating by their own right, but didn't seem anywhere near as real as they might have done when they actually lived in the US. That changed. This kid was 17, and for the first time, they had to be left alone. Their parents had to head off to some charity convention, and it would finish too late to drive home. A quick note: these parents were overly conservative, to the point to where they wouldn't leave their teenager home alone. Even at 17, it was a bit of a stretch for them. While I understand nowadays most are left home at 12 years old, if not younger, some people don't exactly have that luxury. They were a good kid after all. Never been in trouble, and there were no wild parties. They didn't have any friends around or any booze to raid. They simply did their homework, hung out, and went to bed. Oh, and the other reason their mom and dad were happy to leave, there was a Cloudy. Cloudy was their golden retriever, crossed with a husky fur baby, and Cloudy thought she was second mother to my collar. Worshipped them, and their parents knew they'd be safe with their protector. So, when Cloudy began growling at around 3 a.m, she was sleeping on their bed. They began to get an odd feeling, just as they were trying to work out if they were dreaming or not. You know, that fuzzy state you're in when you're suddenly awoken from a deep sleep. Cloudy launched off the bed and positioned herself in front of the window again, growling, hackles up, teeth bared. And then, they heard why. There was a scratching from outside, sounding like just below their window. They could hear the words, "Let me in," followed by their name. Oh, and just to add to what must have already seemed like their worst nightmare, it was their mother's voice calling. Their mother, who had called just a few hours prior and was already miles away. Somehow, they managed to work up the courage to look out of the window. I'm not sure I would have been that brave, and I have to tell you, as they recounted this part to me, I had shivers running down my spine. Cloudy had begun going nuts, barking and growling, and trying to throw herself at the window. All the while, they could clearly hear their mom's voice over and over, the same saying over, "Let me in." And when they looked out their window, there was indeed something down below, something they could just make out in the moonlight. A dog, or to be more clear, something that resembled a dog, except it stood up, proportions all messed up. That, and the fact that it was able to mimic voices, alerted them to exactly what was outside, what they believed to be a skinwalker. They told me that they knew all about them from their mother, and the most important thing, other than quite obviously not letting them in, was to never make eye contact or speak of them directly. If you did happen to look directly at one, that was how they could directly take over you, and how they could use you, mimic you, copy you. They were never entirely sure how this particular one ended up in the British Gardens, but when their parents came back the next day, their mom performed some traditional rituals, and since then, they haven't seen or heard anything again from these creatures. While there are no medicine men nearby that their mothers couldn't utilize, she had made sure that she had learned the correct rituals to rid them of this problem. Pretty scary, right? I always thought that things like this were attached to a location, but maybe they're more attached to a person or culture. I guess sometimes we'll just never really know. I live in part of the States where there are plenty of places that used to belong to the natives, and it's rife with stories and sightings of all sorts of things that their legends and traditions hold. Until recently, I treated those tales and stories with the same interest, yet disbelief as any regular ghost story, or even supposed UFO sighting. I find them fun, but I don't believe it. It was always a lot easier that way too. Because for me at least, if you don't believe, it's not real. And if it's not real, there's no need to be afraid. I like to keep fit, so being healthy in my body and mind is very important. But my body sometimes has other plans, such as a knee injury, which meant I wasn't supposed to go running on it for a while. I could, however, and was encouraged to, take long leisurely walks, and luckily for me, the place where I lived was littered with thick woodland and trails for walking. I'd wake up and put something on my phone like YouTube, put my earbuds in, and off I would go. Sometimes doing 2 or 3 hour walks at a time. And it was actually on one of these early morning walks, I guess around 6 in the morning, when I saw something I can't describe. Because of the early morning hour, I like to get these walks in as much as possible before I come home and start work. I don't tend to see too much other folk. The occasional early dog walker, or even more rare, another jogger. Usually it's just me and the birds, and that's fine. But on this particular morning, I could clearly make out a shape in front of me. Now, I say clearly, and then shape, so let me clarify what I mean. I could see there was something not too far ahead of me, that it was rather large and moving. But we were well into fall at this point, and it was still fairly dark out since it was around 6 in the morning. Although I could see a shape, I couldn't exactly tell who or what it was. And the most odd at first, and then, the more I thought about it, quite frankly, the more terrifying about the shape was, and that it kept changing. Now I know you're probably thinking that it wasn't changing, but as the sun was rising, it was becoming less in shadow, something like that. If you think that it just becomes a normal person or animal taking a stroll just like me. But it absolutely had nothing to do with the sun or shadows. It's been a while since I messed about with my light, making shadow puppets, but I was 100% sure that it simply was impossible to make something turn from the size of a large dog, to a bear, to a person, and back and forth over and over. And you know what? Once my mind accepted what I was seeing, I turned back and ran. Knee be damned, I'd pay for that later, but I'd rather suffer with a messed up knee than stay there any longer. I honestly have no idea what that thing was doing there, but it just oozed evil and wrong, and I will not be going back on that particular trail again, even when my damn knee is better. And that's not the worst of it, because now, I can't stop thinking about what else might be out there. Did I see a skinwalker? Are skinwalkers real? And if they are real, what else is real? Does that mean everything in legends is actually real? I come from a family of hunters. My granddad says our ancestors were trappers back in the day, and we come from a long line of people who supposedly were just born for it. We've traveled all over the states to hunt different things, and have managed to tick most stuff off the list. But there was one creature that remained unticked off the list. And as surprising as it might be, doesn't mean it's not a hard animal to kill. An elk. Granddad hadn't managed one, and neither had Dad, and it was looking like his hunting days were at an end now, since his eyesight had gotten really bad, and even Mom had forbade him from using his gun, in case he shot himself. For whatever reason, my granddad and Dad only stuck to hunting bear and deer. Nothing really else. I mean, a few things here and there, but why they never tackled elk, I'm not so sure. It was up to me to tick elk off that list, and I had the perfect plan. I'd met with some like-minded friends, and we just so happened to have an old wooden lodge in the same spot of the woods where there were plenty of elk. After heading up there, going through a hell of a drive, I didn't tell anybody where I was going. I wanted it to be a surprise. Everything is as my buddy had said. I'd make myself comfortable when I got there, ready to head off very early the next morning. There was a light dusting of snow, but I was prepped for that, and had brought thick, warm outdoor clothing. Anybody who hunts know you have to layer up in order not to freeze your buns off. Waking up the next morning, full of adrenaline and determination, I was going to make sure our family got that thick bag of elk. I dressed warmly and off I went, crunching through the snow, and was so excited to see elk tracks. I got myself in position, and luckily, my buddy already had a makeshift hide up there. And then I saw it. An absolute beast. It was massive. Hell of a lot bigger than anything I was expecting. It was facing away from me, and for some reason, I had the shot but I didn't take it. Part of me wanted to look at it more, look at it in the eye, so if it couldn't see me, somehow, it would know who was the boss, who was always around. I waited, and then it turned. Now, I have killed many things. Obviously not elk, but other animals. My finger should have just been ready to pull that trigger, no matter what. But I froze up. Whatever in God's name that thing was in front of me, it wasn't a regular elk. It was already unusually large, and this wasn't the first time seeing an elk in the wild. When it turned, I saw its face. It looked distorted. I don't know how to describe it, but wrong. Its eyes looked different too, and it looked me right into my eyes, and I felt this ominous feeling. It's really hard to describe. Its face is what will always haunt me. It made me just kind of want to walk off, and after that, I just gave up and left it be. I know there's really not much to my story, and that it might be kind of lame, but there's just something I can't quite put my finger on. I don't really believe in scary stories or Native American lore, but there was something different in these woods that day. Something I can't even begin to describe. Whatever it is, I feel like it shook my soul. I was taking a walk along an isolated area of beach. The place wasn't easy to get to. In fact, you nearly had to break your neck, sliding down steep slopes that weren't exactly safe. You couldn't stand up without falling. That's just how sharp-angled they were. The beach itself was much less hospitable, the sand being mixed with lots of sharp rocks, and jagged ones too, jutting out of the water, that threatened to impale any would-be swimmers that carelessly jump into the water, if there any is such thing as a truly wild beach. This was it. It did seem like the perfect place for me to go away by myself, and gather my thoughts and feelings in isolation. But I did recall seeing a peculiar shape, moving throughout the water. My first instinct was to think it was a crocodile, or an alligator, posing as a dead log perhaps, but there was just too much fluid motion for it to be any sort of reptile. There was too much hair. In fact, it was hard to tell if it was some sort of animal trying to be a dead log, or if it was a dead log trying to be some sort of animal. It came closer, and closer into the shallows, when it finally began to look and emerge something from out of the water. I thought for sure I was looking at some sort of wolf that had a terribly rough time in the wild, because this thing looked rugged. Then its body was visible. I thought that its forelegs were unusually well built and long, but that's when I noticed that they ended in appendages that resembled hands far more than paws. As if this couldn't get any more bizarre, the animal kept rising up out of the water, as if it were walking on its hind legs. Actually, that's what it was doing. It shook itself violently to expel the water that had been logged in its thick, nasty matted fur. Some of the spring water, the smell reaching near me. Rank and musty smelling. It turned what I would call an intelligent presence on me, as I now realized it was aware of me. Now, you want to talk about a scrambling fool. The hillside that deposited me on the wild beach, though it was nearly sheer, I still scrambled up it for all I was worth, for my life. You can tell that I'm not exactly a survivalist, because I took no measures to make sure that thing was either staying put behind or coming after me. I blindly ran like a panicked rabbit, which is a huge 101 no-no. You are to never run from a predator. But hell, I had no idea exactly what I was dealing with. The thing didn't seem to think I was interesting enough to pursue. Fortunately, that thing didn't seem to think I was interesting enough to pursue, which is a good thing. Who knows if I would have lived. Oh, and to add in some extra detail that I might have forgotten. This happened along the Gulf Coast. I won't mention what state, but I had thick forest and everglades near me, where this thing was right next to. The area of beach I was on isn't exactly a touristy beach, but the spot I was at is very warm, very coastal, so it's not like I was at some big tourist beach town. My speculation is that I must have just been there at the wrong moment, when whatever this animal was coming out of the water, to walk back into the thick swamps and trees. I must have just been there at the time to see it, and it having seen me, which is why I think it froze up. I don't believe it was expecting to see me there, and probably unsure of what to do. We nicknamed my black lab Sally, the escape artist, because no matter how we tied her, no matter what we attached her to, she always seemed to find a way of getting loose. The times that a line seemed to hold her, we would joke that she was just allowing herself to be held, that she could really escape anytime she really wanted to. That mostly turned out to be true. It was one of those things that didn't seem to be of any consequence until me and my parents went camping. We went before the weather got too hot, so it would have been around April or May. We took the dog with us, because when the family goes camping, family does include animals. I got my own tent, and Sally was just going to sleep outside of it. I had her leash on, that would be anchored to a simple stake, the sort of thing that seemed to hold well enough, until she decided she wanted to get away badly. I didn't have any major concerns at the time, but things changed that night. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard some major movement outside. With a large black lab like Sally nearby, I wasn't terribly concerned, but I couldn't shake this feeling that there was something that would make my hair stand on end, if only I could actually see it. I unzipped a chink of my tent's door so that I could look outside and get a clear look. To my surprise, Sally was standing on all fours, and she was still as a statue. And there were several points of light that it didn't seem quite right in the distance, and the reason turned out to be because, well, those lights were a set of eyes. There were several things out there that had glowing amber or bronze-hued eyes. Whatever they were, they seemed to be locked in a staring contest with my animal. At length, one of the sets of eyes came close. So close that I could make out the features of the thing, and it was a terrifying sight. I had grown up on a steady diet of pulp horror comics, and that was the incarnation of every illustration of werewolf that I'd ever seen. Except it was real, and it was downright terrifying. Even recalling the memory is kind of hard. It became clear that it had no interest in me. It was really interested in my dog. It came so close to my dog in my tent that I could smell the rancid fur, sweaty and musky, and even tinged with some of the smell of wet dog. It would get so close that it was within striking distance of my poor dog, and Sally was shivering like a leaf. But then, the wolf monster would go back up, and it would walk backwards until it disappeared in the mists. Then, it would come forward again, and come close enough to bump noses with my dog. Also close enough for me to hear its ragged breathing, like a snarl was locked up in its throat, waiting to come out. And then it would back up again. It dawned on me what it was doing. It was trying to get Sally to follow it. Sally must have gotten the memo, because I heard the sound of the earth as the stake that was holding her leash became easily wrestled free. She followed it off with the other glowing pairs of eyes that were veiled in the mists. I was utterly beside myself with panic, but I didn't even bother to move or do anything to alert the monsters. My parents didn't really buy my story as to what I had seen, but they did believe that Sally had run off after something. They said that maybe it was just a squirrel. But what kind of squirrel stands that tall, puts off an aroma that bad, and has eyes that put off light like that? Within the same year, I caught a glimpse of several unusual shapes moving in a nearby woodland, or I thought I saw some wolfish humanoid shape, only with a much smaller, more natural shape of a dog beside it. I had no way of knowing for sure if it was the same monster that had taken my dog, or if that was even my dog with it. I wanted to say to this day that it was merely an invitation, or they could have possibly pulled Sally away to turn her and eat her. I have no idea. Again, writing this to you is kind of hard to do, but I know it's probably for the better. I was hiking out in Northern California, in one of the many redwood forests, just a few hours before sundown, so the sun was riding either low in the sky and casting shadows in between the trees. I didn't want to admit that I was lost, but I was by myself at the time, so there was nobody to admit anything to. It had been largely silent, minus the ambiance of the insects and birds that were winding down for the day. Something, like a scream, pierced my concentration. It was distant, and I could not tell if it was the sound of an animal, or possibly a human. Regardless of its source, it was still disconcerting. I stood for a couple of minutes, trying to gather my bearings. No sooner had I begun moving again, and then I heard the same scream, only this time closer, and much, much more louder, or at least it had much more bass to it. It had the bestial intonations you would expect from an animal, and yet somehow an intelligence to it that you would expect from a human. It's the same feeling that you get when you hear a baby cry right before it learns to say its first words. I'm terrible at analogies, forgive me. It's hard to describe. I called out and responded, asking if somebody needed help. The same voice made a different kind of sound, now what appeared to be a low moan. That's when I began to see the shape of something very tall and muscular. The exact shapes of its edges were hard to make out, but I knew that I was dealing with something unpleasant when I saw two lights of the same color, right where I should be. Feeling a wave of panic right up inside me, but trying to keep my wits about me. There was no guarantee that whatever this was had seen me. The shape moving swiftly between the trees, so I couldn't see it long enough to see if it was looking at me, or focused on something else. I couldn't even tell if it was getting nearer or further away. Deciding not to stick around and find out, grasping at the desperate chance that I was undetected, I too ran between the trees in a zigzag pattern. I couldn't tell if my own breathing or the sound of my footsteps, but I thought I could hear the sound of panting just outside the range of perception. That the panic was beginning to better me, but I couldn't afford to scream. I came over a swell of land and looked behind me at the top where it had come down from. After looking up just in time to see the head of this thing peeking over the hill, it showed me its jagged teeth, and then it was kind of smiling in a demented way. This thing was getting closer. I don't remember much after that, except that I had to run into a park ranger who was doing patrol of the trail. I had not realized just how near the edge of the forest I truly was. I must have babbled incoherently about what had happened, looking back, because he simply invited me to sit in his squad car, and at the same time, he was kind of regarding me as if I could be a possible druggie. I wasn't arrested. I was questioned and allowed free to go after I made a statement. They weren't going to let me go without that, because I was clearly agitated enough that they did believe I saw something. I think a few of them believed I saw something that wasn't human, but they weren't about to stake their jobs or reputations on agreeing with a crazed hiker who claims he saw a werewolf. That's why I don't really venture out to the woods much anymore. Those are my hiking days, and those are long done. Now, I kind of find myself being much more of a recluse, doing anything I can to rid myself of that memory. So, in hopes of typing this up, I can finally kind of maybe therapeutically move past it. I was camping in a very remote part of the Rockies. I was by myself. Being a loner makes you do stupid things like be all alone in the wild with nobody to help you with anything for miles around. But that's just me. The weather had been clear for days, but it was on my last night of camping that an awfully brutal storm swept through the entire area. I had chosen a spot that was out in the open, but the one tree that I camped next to was the tree that fell on my tent, with me on the inside. I was rudely awoken by the sensation of nearly being crushed. That was the true definition of pain in my whole life. The worst kind I've ever felt. It started and burned all at once. No amount of breathing or lying would make it subside. Part of me would have been more than happy to die on the spot, but that didn't happen. The second most painful moment of my life was when the tree began to move for some odd reason. Somebody was handling it, which I couldn't explain for the life of me, since that thing was nearly a full-grown evergreen. Only a monster could have that kind of strength. But my tent was still collapsed on top of me, but just in the right spot, so I wasn't being crushed alive, although smashed and somehow alive. I had no idea who or what was at work outside. I heard some loud grunts and labored breathing, but I didn't see anything until a large hairy hand pulled the tent off of me after the tree was then removed. I think the sharp rise in my blood pressure made my wounds hurt even more. I'd laid there, partly mangled, staring up into the beady eyes of something that looked like a gorilla. The way it looked at me, I could tell it had intelligence in its eyes. It was studying me, as if I was some guinea pig in some 4th grade classroom. It even seemed to understand that I was seriously hurt. However, it was sizing me up for it to be its next meal, or so it looked to be. Apparently, I must have lost consciousness after being in such terrible fear, and nearly after what having happened to me. When I woke up next, I was in the hospital, apparently the ER. Doctors and nurses coming in on regular rounds to check up on me, and they told me I was going to be out of commission for a long time. I also, in the process, lost both of my legs, from mid-thigh down. I told them what I knew, or what I thought I knew. They didn't come out and say it, but I'm pretty sure that they're writing the whole thing off as a product of stress. Although they obviously saw that a tree had fallen on my tent and nearly crushed me. I don't know if they know what happened or why it happened. There was no storm. There was no lightning. To say this tree simply fell is silly. Something, some sort of creature from the woods, pushed this tree over on me and checked up on me. I think it knew it was there. I think it was planning to kill me. Why it didn't take me after I lost consciousness, I have no idea. It's one of the freakiest experiences I've ever had out in the woods, ever. and I want to say it's a Bigfoot, but I can't be too sure. But now, I believe that something exists. My uncle called me up, and I could tell he had been drinking and he was out hunting. He does hunt while intoxicated. How the man hasn't shot anybody yet for mistaking them for a bear or a buck, I have no idea. His imagination also tends to get the better of him when he drinks, and it doesn't help him that his eyes are going. But beside the point, he's an old man set in his ways, and there's real no way to take his guns away unless he actually hurts someone. So, after getting the call, I took that as a cue that it was time to go make sure that my uncle didn't accidentally shoot any innocent bystander. He rambled on about finding some great furry boulder. That filled me up with fear. It sounded like my uncle was about to pick a fight with a bear. However, it turned out to be much bigger. I arrived at the woods on his property, and I followed the trails to where he described. And there he was with a shotgun, dangerously close to something that was absolutely huge. It had its back turned to us, and it sat on a felled tree, leaning forward, not moving. I dared to get in front of it, and I saw that it had a face that could have passed as a human if it hadn't been covered in hair. And when I say human, I mean incredibly ugly. This thing, for whatever reason, appeared dead, as if it was just left there. We checked the body, or what I would presume to be a body, for any sort of nicks, cuts, or bullet holes. There were none, but this thing stunk to high heaven. I immediately put together a speech in my head that I was going to share this find with my uncle. It was about all the reasons we shouldn't be there at that moment, and why it was a good idea to leave, and to not be around when this thing, or whoever killed it, came for it. I was coming back to my uncle's side when he raised his double-barreled shotgun and gave a whoop and unloaded both barrels into the woods. My face turning white. There were noises in the woods all around us, getting closer. The noise I can only really describe as a whooping sound, if that makes any sense, followed by low groans and moans and grunts. I grabbed my uncle and we bolted out of there, running for our lives. I don't know what was in the woods that day, but whatever it was, however many of them there were, must have been coming for their kill, which would have been the creature that lay before us, only slightly bigger than a black bear. I to this day have no idea what it is we encountered. Part of me would like to think it's a Bigfoot, but why would there be a dead Bigfoot lying in the middle of an opening, with more of them coming to get us or it? None of it makes sense, but one thing still remains. The thought just terrifies me going back to it, and I never really go back to my uncle's hunting property if I can. I had to come down with something, and I was trying to sleep while I was on my vacation. Realistically, I should have been able to get some extra rest, because I was in my cabin, which resides on a hillside in a pine forest. I won't reveal the location, just in case this story gets out there, and people, for whatever reason, try to look for it. I really don't want any vandals or unwelcome visitors, thank you. Besides that, just as I had fallen asleep, this thundering sound woke me up with a start. It was so noisy that the windows rattled. And having been just woken up so rudely, and being sickly, you can imagine I was not the happiest person in the moment. Throwing on some clothes, I was going to go out there and give whoever it was a piece of my mind. I stepped outside, and what would have been an otherwise perfect summer evening, with the exception that I felt sick. This awful bellowing was coming from up top of the hill, on top of everything. Whoever was making that noise had to have a massive set of lungs. It was terrifying to hear. It sounded like it could have came from a giant. That's when I saw movement directly up ahead of me, up the hill. I then saw enough that I know that this was not human. In fact, it was much bigger than any human. It had arms like a tree limb, and a torso like a trunk. And here's why I'm going to lose a lot of friends. They're going to think I'm crazy. The thing looked every bit like every report of Bigfoot that I've ever heard all my life. The key difference being that I've never heard of a Bigfoot holding onto a tree, lifting his head to the sky. My senses were heightened in the moment, so I was able to take in every little detail. It even kind of had a beard coming from its face, albeit salt and peppery. It was waving in the evening breeze. If this creature wasn't planning to kill something, then I don't know what it was doing, other than yelling its war cry. This terrified me. I took a cue from every monster movie that I've ever been exposed to, and I got the hell out of there, instead of just standing there like an idiot. So, I ran back inside, and I hid. I know, probably not the most dramatic encounter story you've ever received, so do whatever you want with it. But I firmly believe that I saw a Sasquatch up here in the woods. I woke up one morning to the sight of my sheep just outside my bedroom window. That meant the fence was now down. I had to wonder, what could have been out there to possibly knock down my fence? I come outside to find my entire flock scattered every which way. And because I live out in the country, I guess it's not a huge deal, although there's not a whole lot out here that really pose danger, other than coyotes, mountain lions, and bears. But upon investigation of the fence, the damage done is something you'd expect a car driving through it. This section of fencing wasn't just knocked over, it was mangled, torn out of the ground. I dropped a lot of money that day getting the fence back up, and spent even more in terms of nerves getting all my sheep together. I didn't spend the time with them that I should have, getting used to them and calling them. I tried to put the whole thing behind me and forget about the fact that I just spent about a month's worth of expenses in a single afternoon. I came outside the next morning to the exact same thing, only even more of the fence had been torn down. I was wondering how this happened, twice, without me ever being woken up. That level of damage to a fence should clearly make noise. So, I decided it was time to camp out and see just what was going on. After spending money on getting it fixed a second time, I wasn't going to be able to afford to get it done too many more times. After finally again getting all my sheep together, fortunately, they hadn't wandered too far. I set up a tent with my shotgun. My farmhouse that I had, which was respectably sized, kind of looked like a little dot from where I was. One of those moments where I realized just how much land I truly own. Gratitude was a healthier emotion for me in the moment than being sour. It had gotten dark quick, but I did have a pair of night vision goggles, which helped me tremendously. If I had fallen asleep, I wouldn't have woken up. The sound of my visitor was so soft that you would have sworn that they were a ninja. Putting on my goggles, I turned them on and looked, peeking my head out and stopping for a second. Towering as tall as a small tree, but something that resembled a large ape, lit up by my goggles. It was approaching the sheep pen very cautiously. I saw the monster reach its arms out, grab hold of the fence, pull it out of the ground, and snap it and rip it, as if it were simply a fence built of toothpicks and string. This giant monster ape thought this must have been a joke. I watched him walk in, the sheep literally terrified and going crazy. It grabbed 2 smaller of my sheep, put them under its arms, and casually walked off. I sat there with my mouth wide open, not even sure what I had to deal with or how I would deal with this problem. Well, turns out not long after that, before I really had a chance to deal with the issue, I ended up getting some severe health problems that I don't want to get into. Long story short, within a few months, I lost my house, foreclosed, and now I don't live there anymore, nor have I in quite some time. But after that night, that was it. I did not lose any more sheep, and I got the fence fixed one last time. Fortunately for me, if the problem came back, it didn't seem to show itself, at least in its destructive nature. I love to swim. It's one of my favorite things to do. On top of that, I love finding places that are a little more unusual to take a bath in. So, not pools or lakes or the ocean. I prefer rivers and swamps and springs, places that can be found off the beaten track. Now, of course, I know these places can tend to be dangerous. I'm a very competent and strong swimmer, but I don't fancy my chances against a gator, so I'm not dumb. I have seen all sorts of weird stuff in those rivers and swamps. Even once found a body. Didn't stick around too long after I noticed it was a human swaying against the current. I dialed 911, and I was out of there. Turned out to be some poor runaway. At least the parents got closure, and the body buried. You think that would be the worst thing I've ever seen, right? Well, it isn't. One day, I was out deep in Louisiana swamps, and I saw something that utterly blew my mind. As I said, I like to find hidden, unique away places to take a dip, but I'm also careful not to end up as some croc's dinner. Well, in and around, you gotta be careful. Snakes are dangerous too. I've seen some of them crawling around near the water, and a damn side bigger than I am. So, what I found this stretch of water, it was like some offshoot from the bayou. I did all my usual checks and balances before I even put a foot. I couldn't see any obvious signs. I stuck a long stick in the water, swirled it up real good, and no long slithering body surfaced. So, I thought I was safe. I got in, feeling that immense pleasure that I get from knowing I'm maybe the only person around here. As I'm slowly swimming around, feeling pleased with myself and very smug, I instantly get the sensation when you know somebody or something is looking at you. I could feel these eyes boring into my back. Also, I'm used to some funky smells hitting me when I'm out there in these waters, especially the swamps, where stagnant mud gets all swirled about. But this was awful. Like a damn stank, like I was on a pig farm, and they'd been rolling around in their own feces all day. I turned around, real slow-like, as I don't want to spook whatever's behind me, just praying real hard that it wasn't no gator. If I told you that finding a human foot was like finding Santa had been on Christmas morning compared to what I now saw in the water, that might suggest to you just how much fear I was experiencing. It weren't no gator. Well, not any kind of gator like I've ever seen. It was bigger than me, and was standing in the water. The river wasn't that deep. If I was to stand, my feet on the ground, it would likely come up to my waist. The thing in front of me must have been real tall, as the water barely covered where his groin is. It was real strong looking. Its torso was like that of an alligator or reptile, but if you flipped it onto its back, all scaly but real ripped and muscly. It did have human-like arms, dangling from the side, rather than little gator limbs, although its hands looked like they were webbed and clawed. It had a long, thick neck. Again, I could literally see the muscles throbbing, like some bodybuilder on steroids. And then finally, the head. Now, it didn't have a regular alligator-looking head. Like anything, nothing about what I was looking at was normal in any way. The head resembled more of a lizard, or a snake. Large bulbous shapes, with no visible nose or ears. Just 2 large yellow eyes, and a large forked mouth. Tons of tiny sharp teeth. It just stood there, standing its ground, not moving closer to me, but not backing away further. I really thought I was a goner. I kind of got the hint that it was contesting its ground. Maybe somebody would be finding my dismembered body floating around in the water. That's if this thing didn't just decide to devour me whole. So, you know what I did. I screamed, as loud and powerful as I possibly could. I screamed and screamed, like I doubt I had since I was a preschooler. I think I might have freaked it out. Whether it didn't like the frequency, or being afraid made me scream like a girl, or how loud it was. I guess looking back I'll never know. But the more noise I made, it seemed like it was getting really annoyed or pissed. It quickly moved out of the way, and into the nearby brush. I stayed there for a few moments longer, catching my breath, and then hoping I was about to die of having a damn heart attack, having survived a freak encounter with a reptoman. Thankfully, I managed to muster up some strength from somewhere, and I too ran out of the river and back to my car, where I didn't even bother changing, just drove home in wet clothes and wet shorts. Don't feel like I scared it off. I think I merely irritated it. It didn't seem too happy about me yelling and screaming and making noise. It seemed irritated, if I had to guess its proper demeanor. Now, why it went off to the bush to my left, I don't know. Part of me likes to think that it was circling around in the brush to come and grab me from behind. But I don't know, because once it exited into the brush, I couldn't hear it anymore. So, that means it could have been possibly waiting to trap me, or even worse, take me away and kill me. We were the first small town in our state to have a nuclear power plant constructed within the town limits. We were told that it was supposed to just be big enough to power us, and they wanted to see what the long-term impact of a nuclear power was on a smaller community. My parents being hardcore environmentalists, and they opposed it from the first whisper of it, which was well before I was ever born. So, it's been around for a long time. I've been paying attention to how my parents felt about the whole thing, and I had also been listening to everybody else's side of the story. This was also the time when just about every phone now had a video camera in it, so it wasn't a stretch of the imagination when I got the notion to go and try and make a documentary about the plant. I didn't share my plans with my parents, because they would have forbidden me to go anywhere near that place, treating it like Chernobyl. I didn't want to be too obvious about what I was doing, so I took the shirt that I was planning on wearing, which was just a denim button-up shirt that had plenty of pockets on the front, and I modified one of the pockets so there would be an opening where the lens of the camera could see out. It wouldn't be a fully unobstructed vision, but it would be better than having the thing out in the open where everybody saw what I was up to. I didn't think anybody in that place was expecting a 17-year-old kid to just walk in and interview people. Everybody was looking at each other, as if this was their first time ever dealing with anybody outside. I politely asked every single person I saw that I would like to speak to whoever ran the place, since I was doing an interview for a personal project. I held a notepad to draw my attention away from the camera, and just like that, the director of the entire facility was paged to come and see me. I remember him being pleasant enough, as far as first impressions go. He had invited me up to his office on the 4th story. He put me at ease and asked me how much he could help me. I told him what I was up to. It was a very pleasant exchange. So, after everything was done, I put the SD card of my phone into my laptop and reviewed the footage. It was remarkable high quality, and the field of view was all but entirely unobstructed. But the longer I watched, the more I saw that I did not remember. The director smiling far less than I remember. Instead, he had this glassy, intense stare. When he sat with me for his interview, his eyes transformed, like having long slit pupils, and his skin looking pale and slightly scaly in appearance, whispering something bizarre under his breath. After those mutterings, I wordlessly got up and marched at a slow pace outside the building on my way back home. There had never been an interview based on what I saw. After going through the footage, there was no actual interview at all. I just sat down with him, and he muttered at me. After studying the footage where he was saying those strange things under his breath, when his eyes transformed, I couldn't help but remark at how much he looked kind of like a snake or serpentine. He definitely resembled something that was cold-blooded. I don't know if what he did to me was hypnoticism or something else entirely, but I just know that it somehow created false memories in me while wiping on others. What's your take on this? And I'm curious what your listeners would think of this. Not to be presumptuous to think that you would actually broadcast my story, but if you do, I appreciate it. I'm sure there are others like me that have very similar experiences with possibly similar beings and would like to feel validated. Thank you for even taking the time to read this. I was wandering around the woods, a much older growth of oak trees that had seen times long gone by. So, many of the trunks were massive, and many of them were also hollowed out. I was leaning up against one of them, listening to the subtlety of the breeze, when I thought I heard something stirring. It wasn't a scraping sound like you'd expect from the claws of an animal, but somehow softer and more wet. After my curiosity took hold, I started looking for an opening, which wasn't hard to find. This was a large open gash where a cavity had formed over the centuries. There was something that looked akin to the egg sac of a spider, except it was much larger. I usually don't go out of my way to disturb nature, but I couldn't leave this alone. It was the first time I'd ever seen anything like it. I took out my pocket knife and began making slight cuts. At first, I thought I discovered the abdomen of an incredibly large baby spider, but the abdomen turned out to be the head of something else. Combine the features of an iguana and a chameleon and a snake and give it human-like eyes, and that's as best as I can describe what was suspended. After a few seconds, this thing's eyes shot up and looked at me. A deafening shriek from behind me made me jump back and stop what I was doing. Something much taller than I, much uglier than me, and yet vaguely resembling the small thing I had just seen in the tree, stood only 3 meters away, leaning forward with its spine parallel to the ground, hissing at me, revealing tons of vicious crocodile-like teeth. I'll always remember that as terrifying. It's a sight that has never left my memory. I immediately stepped away from the tree, and this creature, whatever it was, took the opportunity and lunged forward, doing what I believe bluff charged me. It had the ability to kill me, but chose not to for some reason. I took that as my cue to get the hell out of there, not even looking behind me in case this thing was coming after me. I paid it no more mind. Anyway, I wanted to send my encounter into you, in hopes that someone else has heard something similar, or maybe you have gotten other stories with a similar finding. I feel like mine's a little out there, but nonetheless, just as terrifying. When I was a kid, My grandpa used to tell me stories about a red-eyed giant that lived in the woods behind his house. It was one of those things that was both equally fascinating and terrifying. Every time we went to visit, I'd beg him to tell me more. But whilst also being too frightened to ever go into the woods myself, my mom would shake her head and scold him for scaring me, while my dad would stay quiet. One time, I asked him about it since Grandpa still lived in the house that both he and my dad grew up in. Dad admitted that one time he had seen something in those woods. He hadn't gotten a proper look, as he'd been too scared. But whatever was there behind the trees was real big and real skinny. He didn't remember nothing about red eyes, but he got the distinct feeling that he was being watched. So he never played in those woods again. Once I hit my late teens, Grandpa started to get sick. Then, when I was a junior in my college, he passed away. It was the first time that I had been back to the house for years, having always gone to the hospital. As I stood there in the kitchen, staring out at the huge window into those woods, I had never dared to go into again as a kid. I was filled with the overwhelming urge to do it. I was a man in that point, no longer a kid. I studied the field. There were no such things as red-eyed giants, I thought. So, off I went. I didn't really have a plan at the time, just wanted to walk. I guess I was hit by the beauty of it, and felt remorseful that I have been swayed by childhood fantasies and missed out on years of playing with all this wonderful nature. The further I walked, the more annoyed I began to feel, at myself primarily, for believing such nonsense, at my grandfather for scaring me. I had conveniently forgotten how I was equally scared and thrilled, and at my dad for the verification. At some point, I just stood there, fuming, grieving, venting. I realized that I did not have a clue where I was, couldn't see the house or even had any idea which direction it was in now. And right on cue, that was when I heard the noises. 'Cause up until that moment, I had been so preoccupied with my own emotions that my senses, I think, were delayed, if that makes sense. What I mean is, I hadn't allowed my ears to notice how quiet it was. Hadn't seen that there were no little critters running around. No birds. Nothing. That, despite being completely out in the open, the air smelled close and damp. The noises seemed to be coming from a very tight cluster of trees, their branches so tight and entwined, there was not a scrap of light to be seen. It almost looked unnatural. So, I stood there for a moment, contemplating the next move. And that's when I truly saw what my grandfather told me. I guess it would have qualified as a giant to my grandfather and dad, as they were kids when they saw it. It was real tall, that's for sure. But I'd say more like 7 feet. I'm 6'4" myself. It was more length of its limbs. It had long, sickly arms and legs, whereby human arms reach around thigh length. These were abnormal and reached down to the knees. It appeared to be a sickly bleach white, and hairless and naked. Although having clear view, it didn't appear to have any genitalia. Its thin torso was sexless, and looked like it was just skin and bone. No fat or muscle. All of that led to an overly large egg-shaped head, with huge red eyes. It didn't approach me. It just stood staring. One interesting thing to note about its eyes is when I mention red eyes, I'm not talking about your cliché red eyes from monster books or movies, where they have the traditional glowing, unnatural red eyes. These were more kind of like an albino animal's eyes, where generally, if you look at any albino animal, their eyes are red, but they kind of had a red hue to them. That's how these resembled. Like I said, no glow at all. It was just bizarre. Not freezing up, and not sitting there thinking what to do. I wasn't taking any chances. I ran, and I ran, and I ran. I didn't care if I was 4, 14, or 24. There was this thing in front of me in the woods that my grandfather had told me all about, and at one point actually chose to believe in. So, my dad insisted we sell the house. There was no way he ever wanted to live there again. Not with that thing out there. And after my own experience, I can finally say I believe him. Even though this happened years and years ago, we ended up selling the house, and this story is always one that sticks with me, as one that still bothers me. In fact, sometimes I have a hard time retelling it, because it brings back these memories. I hope it helps you. As a kid, I loved to play manhunt all the time in the woods behind the school I was at, since it had the best places to hide in. There was just one rule from all parents. Don't go to the back area of the woods, where there were small caverns. They were far too dangerous. Now I should explain. These weren't deep, spelunking caverns. These were just small little indentations in the earth. I mean, they were more than tunnels. You could actually go in them, and probably explore them to some degree. But they were very small, in comparison to the more recognized cave systems of America. There was also talk of shear drops, bears, and other sorts of animals, more applicable to us kids, ghosts and monsters that lived in them and ate children. We were all sufficiently scared enough to not go near them. However, sometimes it takes something quite insignificant to make you break an unwritten rule. You see, I was sick and tired of being found first at the time. The fact that I was one of the tallest kids, and at the time, I had long red hair, which my mom insisted on tying in high bunches, meant I was easily spotted, time and time again. It was becoming very annoying, and a running joke with the others, at how useless I was at hiding. So, being a headstrong kid, determined to make them shut up, I knew exactly where I should go, where no man dared to tread. The caves. I ran there as fast as I could one day when the counting began. And they were right at the very far end of the woods, and it was pretty dark because the lack of light hitting that spot, and the very tall trees and timber halting any sunlight from getting into this area. I had never been this far, and I will admit, looking back, that I was scared and nervous. Now that I was actually there, staring at the mouths of the small cavern entrances, I began getting a bad feeling. It was probably at the time a mixture of guilt, because I had never really truly disobeyed my parents like this, and apprehension. But being a kid, I thought to myself, I've come this far. I began hearing shouts, swiftly followed by "found you." I had no time to lose. I ran over to the first mouth of the cave and took a deep breath. My best chance ever to actually win the game and to prove these caves were more innocent than we ever thought. I would be a hero. I gingerly began to edge my way in when, I swear, I saw eyes. I wasn't a dumb kid. Despite making this real bad, I knew it was possible that there would be things living in them. We didn't actually have bears in our area. I figured that was just something else made up to keep the kids away. But there would be other animals in there. Don't bats usually hang about in caves? So it was totally possible that the red eyes that appeared belonged to a pale face way up in the air. as if the body attached to the face was tall. I remember standing there, frozen to the ground. When people say it is built into our DNA in these situations for either fight or flight, they forget to mention that it is also totally normal to just freeze up, which I did, until the face with those eyes became a little more clear, and as it became a little closer out of the cave, I can see indeed that it was not a cave-dwelling fox or raccoon or something. My best guess on it to this day is it was simply an alien. You know, you can get those tiny stretchy alien toys, kind of like in the dollar store. It looks similar to that. A long, tall body, very stretched arms and legs. That was enough to make me unfreeze. In more ways than one, unfortunately, as not only did my legs start to move, so did my bladder, and I peed my pants. I somehow managed to trip over my own feet and fell now on my wet butt. I began screaming as loud as I could, and in the process of doing so, this thing, whatever it might have been, slowly retreated back further into the darkness of the cavern. I carried on screaming until a couple of my braver friends came running. They dared to cross the invisible threshold of the do not enter and rushed over to find me, not at exactly my best. Let's just say I was a mess, snotty, shivering, and quivering. But thankfully, everybody saw how genuinely terrified I was. I never did get made fun of. Luckily, my friends were good. They took me home, let me calm down, and I explained what I saw. Somehow, I didn't get into any trouble. One look at me, and my parents figured I had been punished enough. They also reinforced that we were to never go back to those caves. It actually took us a long time to ever even return to those woods, because before then, we played there all the time. But after that, I even think the other kids were bothered by it. Now, I'm a grown adult with kids of my own, writing this to you. But every so often now, I dream of that tall, pale creature with red eyes lurking in that cave. It still freaks me out. Back in 2018, I took this girl that I was dating at the time camping. She was already an outdoorsy type like me, and it seemed like a real romantic setup. Some alone time with nature, and then sharing a sleeping bag in the evening. I found the right location, not too far away, but in an area of great beauty. I even brought along some wine, cheese, chocolate, candles, all the stuff to make the ladies feel happy. The first night was perfect. So much so, I was beginning to think that she could possibly be the one at the time. With that preoccupying my mind, I wonder if I missed any telltale signs that something was up. We'd planned a hike that morning before heading back to the campsite, so we packed up the valuables and off we went. I just remember that I couldn't stop staring at her. Even after a day and night in the woods, she was still stunning. That might have been why it didn't occur to me at first that there was activity in the trees where we were headed toward. It was actually her who stopped me, pressing a finger to her lips and whispered. Sure enough, I heard a loud rustling and stomping noises. We could even see trees shaking and leaves falling. Whatever was over there wasn't small. We saw it. The best way I can describe what we saw, well, have you ever heard of the urban legend Slenderman? Because I swear, he, or something very much like him, was standing not too far away from us. Totally pale and white, and had large black holes for eyes. Probably 8 feet tall if I had to guess. It looked so disproportionate. I have no idea how this thing held itself up. Long skinny legs, longer arms. I began crying, and we both ran all the way back to the campsite. We packed up and we got out of there really quick. Luckily, this thing didn't try and follow after us, but now we'll never know. We got out of there so quick, thankfully. So, I told my girlfriend at the time, Slenderman is a real person. It's a real thing. Her and I eventually broke up about 6 months later, due to irreconcilable differences. I usually don't tell a lot of people this, but I personally believe that I've seen a dead Chupacabra on the side of the road. Last year, my job entailed me to drive from different locations across New Mexico. I've been to Nevada and around the area. I prefer that my job details stay more private, as I'm not comfortable sharing any of that sensitive information. I will say though, at the time, I smoked like a chimney, and cannot smoke in my company vehicle in which I drove. So, I would often make frequent stops along the side of the road to light one up. It's not what I wanted to do, but I didn't have a choice. I do remember this event quite well though. I was probably about 80 or so miles outside of Tucson, headed east, and it was getting a little dusky outside. I pulled over on the side of the road for a smoke, and I thought I would sit outside my car and enjoy the cool evening breeze. Well, what am I kidding? It's Arizona. There ain't nothing cool about it. But it was at least a breeze nonetheless. It had been at least 4 or 5 hours since my last smoke break anyway, since I was trying to make good time to my next location. I figure I had a good 5 or so minutes to spare since I was going over the speed limit. I'm sitting there, smoking my cigarette, looking off in the distance when my eye catches something on the ground, probably about 50 feet away from me in the dirt. I don't know why I didn't catch it at first, but it looked to be like a dead animal or some sort. Not really anything surprising, since animals die all the time out here. The conditions are extreme, and this is a busy road. But the more I'm looking at it, the more my brain is having a hard time registering what animal this could be. My brain just can't configure the puzzle pieces right, and it's left me confused. After about 30 seconds of trying to figure this out, I just say screw it in my mind and throw my cigarette down. I walk on over there to see exactly what animal this is, and I'm surprised. I thought that coming up close to it, I would be able to rightfully say it was just a mangled coyote that had gotten ran over by a big truck, but this was an animal I was not familiar with. I have a couple of close native friends that I told the story to, and they told me that it sounds like I saw a dead skinwalker that had gotten hit by a semi-truck. I don't know. All the depictions I've ever seen of skinwalkers don't look anything like what I saw. This thing was smaller. Well, I don't want to say smaller, because it was still a larger animal. I'm going to tell you the size of a dog, because that makes the most sense, but more like a pit bull-sized dog. The only problem is it had really short back legs, and long gangly forearms that formed into tiny 3-fingered hands that looked to even have claws on the end of them. It was very humanoid looking in the body, and the face was also much flatter than a dog's. It had 2 large fangs protruding from its mouth with sharper, rigid teeth in between. It looked to be whatever animal it was probably had mange or something. It looked to be somewhat fresh, the body, and was probably ran over in the last 12 to 15 hours, if I had to guess. Part of its body was contorted and crushed because it looks like it was the spot that had been ran over or hit. Part of its body was completely crushed, which is what I believe it died from, and probably got knocked over or flew over off the road. I want to talk about the fangs though, because I've never in my life seen an animal with 3 to 4 inch canine-like fangs hanging out of its mouth. This thing looked like a little mini vampire with exaggerated things. Although physically it looked like a mixture of a dog and a human, if that makes sense. I'm not talking about no werewolf or anything like that. It looked more like a science experiment gone wrong. Like somebody was trying to make a monster and fuse dog DNA with human, and it somehow got screwed up and died. I don't know. Between the general abnormality of the monster and the fact that it was mangled from death by a semi-truck, I couldn't give you an actual answer. Skinwalker or not, this thing was freaky to look at. I probably stood there and spent more time observing than I really should have. In fact, I probably freaked myself out too much, because the more questions I had, the more I wanted to look at it. The more I wanted to look at it, the more questions I had. I had probably sat there for about 10 minutes before I left. It wasn't until a little later on that I kind of put two and two together and realized it was probably a Chupacabra, if anything. It was after I watched the show on them that I really saw the resemblance and put it in my head that that is what it had to be. I didn't think they were real, but this thing must have been traveling at night and somehow gotten smacked by a truck oncoming. I guess I'm lucky that I saw it before the vultures and other wildlife ate through it. The weird thing was, though, that there were no flies or anything buzzing around it. There was also no smell or odor, and it was a blazing hot day. Just two things that stick out to me that are odd. I'll let you be the judge. Make of it what you will, but that's my experience, and it's one of those things that's going to forever kind of creep me out. About 10 years ago, I used to do some minor ranch handing and help around a few farms down in the general New Mexico area where I lived there for a short period of time. One farm that I remember very distinctly had a problem of supernatural proportion. They had a Chupacabra problem, and I'm not afraid to come out and say it. I'm going to be blunt about it. I've never believed in ghosts or supernatural nonsense. I never paid attention to Bigfoot or any of that stuff, but what I encountered and experienced on that ranch, along with several others, I can't deny it anymore. There's nothing else this creature could have been, because no animal does what this thing did. It's unnatural, and I know for a fact that there is no predator on this God-given earth that drains the blood of animals like this thing did. For whatever reason, I'm not sure why these things, yes, I say things because there were several of them. It wasn't just one singular thing. They would target the horses, and they would show up really early in the morning. I'm talking around 1 a.m. to 3 a.m., usually. They would show up in groups of 3 to 4 and break into the barn and stables. They managed to successfully take and kill 2 of our horses. When we found them the following morning, they had 2 large holes in their lower neck, and their bodies were completely drained of all blood. It was chilling to know that such an animal could do such a thing. I'll tell you what though, that event really made our owner up his firepower tenfold, and before you know it, we had a bunch of extra hired guards walking around, fully armed with semi-automatic rifles. With all the extra muscle around for protection, I don't think we managed to kill even one of those things. I can tell you that I've probably heard several gunshots almost every night, if not every other night following. You would always know they were around because the horses would start going crazy in the stalls. You could tell they were really freaked out by something. Sure enough, the guards would go by and shine their lights, and there would be these little buggers. I shouldn't say little buggers. These things were probably the size of a small dog with large fangs. They kind of hunched over. The best way I can describe it is it kind of reminded me of a dog when you have a dog sit up and fold its paws in. You would usually only do this if you were to give a dog a treat, but that's what comes to mind. These things were gray and had a short snout with large fangs protruding at the front. Their eyes were large and dark and sunken in. I couldn't tell exactly what color, if there was any color, because the only time I saw them was when they generally reflected eyeshine late at night. They were a true nuisance, and we dealt with them for quite some time. Things died down after a few months, but it was quite a while there that they really tried to get more horses, and they couldn't. Surprisingly, they never came after any of our other livestock. We had chickens, pigs, and several other livestock that, in my opinion, were in a much more vulnerable location than our horses. Maybe these things have it out for horses? Maybe they have a taste for horse meat. I don't know what you want to call it. When we found the 2 horses' bodies, there wasn't a lick of meat or blood anywhere on the horse. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken bones or gashes of any kind, just the 2 large puncture holes in its neck. That's the kind of stuff that keeps you up at night, when you realize that this sort of thing is true. It's like I'm living in the X-Files. It makes you sit back and wonder, what else do they tell you is a lie that is actually really out there and exists right now? Sure, these things never attacked us to try to go after us to my knowledge. I feel like given the chance, if they were backed into a corner, who knows what they would be capable of. My name is Mark, and I'm part Cuban. My father is full-blooded Cuban, and currently lives in Cuba, while my mother is half Italian, half Portuguese. My mother and father met, had me, and then separated when I was really young. I didn't really grow up knowing my father since I moved to the United States with my mother when I was very young. She remarried very quickly to an American man, and I didn't really have much of a relationship with my real father growing up. That is, until my later teens. I'm now in my early 30s, and I visited my father sometimes, but he mainly comes up here to visit every now and then, and we have a fantastic relationship. All of the family matters aside, he deals with a common problem that many local farmers in his area deal with: Chupacabra. To give a little lesson to those that know nothing about the Chupacabra, Spanish for goat sucker. These are beings that steal and kill livestock and suck the blood out of their bodies. My father has lost well over a dozen goats and several other livestock to these creatures over the years. I know this because when I call him, he's often complaining about it, not having the money, and means to barter for more. I didn't really get to start to listening to creepypastas and scary stories until I was older, so once I started to learn about this stuff while my dad's thing was going on, it was just kind of ringing a bell in my head. I've always been a big believer in cryptids and things you can't see, and having this happen firsthand is just downright terrifying. Even though I'm not experiencing it, my father is, and it is very, very real for him. He's just a simple man trying to get by on life, and these creatures are coming and killing off his animals. I don't think I really started to talk to him about them and really get his side of the story until I watched some Chupacabra stuff myself, reading a little bit of research and stories as well as watching encounters with them. That's when I decided to talk to my father more about it, since he does believe they are Chupacabras as well, but knows nothing of them beyond what he experiences with them. By that, I mean he hasn't read any encounters, hasn't been exposed to our American pop culture. He doesn't watch any documentaries or any sort of thing like that. He explains to me, though, that they have really large black eyes and long, droopy fangs. Tells me that they are of the devil, and that they look like they've come from hell. These are the descendants of the night, and they are here to scare and torment. I'm agnostic, but my father is very Catholic, and tells me he prays against them every day. Not too many months after all this started happening, a few of them, I guess, tried to break into his house by scratching at the windows and doors. Petrified with fear, all my father could do is pray that these things will leave him alone. They still will come during the night to try to get into his house, wiggling his door handle and looking for weak spots to enter. My father doesn't believe that these things wouldn't try and kill him, so he keeps everything securely locked. I'm really worried about him because this is still an ongoing occurrence, even as I write this to you. I've tried to get him out here to the United States, but he just doesn't want to leave his farm. I don't know what to do. Three years ago, I went on a vacation and had one of my best friends pet sit for me. At the time of this, I lived in Nevada and was taking a road trip to see a girlfriend who lived in northern Cali at the time. I was going to be gone for a week, and all was well. I should mention that prior to this, I have never had any experiences that were weird in any way, shape, or form. Life for me has been fairly normal, and I've enjoyed that until now. I don't want strange and creepy things to happen to me, but I guess you don't ask for these things, they just come to you. I had called my friend every few days just to check in to make sure that everything was okay, and that my dog was doing good. I trusted my best friend, and everything had gone great up until the very last day, where I didn't hear from her at all. I didn't think much of it, and when I finally got back to my house later on in the evening, and my friend was on the front porch crying, I get out of the car to greet her, and she's very visibly shaken. I try to talk to her, but she's not really responding. I can see in her eyes there's something really wrong with my dog. I asked her if my dog's okay, and she just shakes her head no, that she doesn't know what happened to her. This is when I start to panic and frantically begin asking, "What do you mean you don't know? Where is she?" Before totally breaking down and sobbing, she looks right at me and tells me she's dead. Before I have a mental breakdown myself, I keep begging her to tell me where she is. She finally points out back and tells me that she's there and that she found her dead this morning and doesn't know what got her. After running to the back with everything I had in me, to only see my dog dead on the ground was one of the most heartbreaking experiences I wouldn't wish on anybody, not even my worst enemy. My dog was my best friend, and it took a long while for me to ever truly get over it. I still miss her so much to this day. I thought she had gotten killed by maybe a pack of coyotes, but she wasn't mangled or bloodied in any way. In fact, she looked rather peaceful, like she had just fallen or collapsed to the ground and died. I tried to move her body around to see if I can find any reason that she would have just suddenly died. When I moved her, her neck moved, and these two large holes shone right back at me. There wasn't a drop of blood, but there were clearly 2 puncture wounds in her neck. Both holes, I would say, roughly the size of a number 2 pencil. What out there makes 2 puncture marks in an animal's neck like this? I thought to myself. Well, in the moment, it was more of an emotional meltdown and a lot of tears than it was fear or wondering what killed my dog. Fast forward about 6 months, and the friend that watched my dog actually ended up moving into that same house because I actually moved to Northern Cali with my friend that I visited. We went in on a house together to roommate since it fit for both of our jobs. Me and my best friend in Nevada still stayed in very close contact. Sometimes we talked and she would try and confide in me that she's been having some strange experiences in that house. When I would ask her to elaborate more, she had mentioned that she had been hearing banging against her back windows and walls at night, and even went so far as to have a security/surveillance system installed. Then she went on to tell me that she had been seeing this tiny little gray person with claws trying to break into the back window. She kept saying, I know, it sounds crazy, but I promise this is what's happening." I asked her if she had any of the surveillance footage to show me, and she said that the police had taken it. Shortly after she began to see this short, gray humanoid with claws, she called the police, shown them the footage, and asked what was going on. I guess several other of the neighbors had been calling into the police as well, complaining about similar circumstances. That's when the police force stepped in, confiscated her entire surveillance system and her computer and hard drive. Next thing you know, I stopped getting phone calls from her, and now I can't even reach her. I haven't been able to get a hold of her in a long time. I even sent her a card not too long ago and never heard anything back. I would usually always at least get a text message or phone call, but nothing. I've been listening to your channel for months now, and I don't want to be a doomer, but everything I've heard in your stories and things that have happened to people in your stories is happening to me in real life. I feel like I'm in some sort of fictional horror story. Maybe there's more to my dog being killed than I would like to think. Maybe there's a reason the police confiscated her equipment, and God only knows what happened to her. I hope she's okay. Hi, I live out in Central Oregon. Central Oregon is a vast high desert full of rattlesnakes, punishing high temperatures, and tons upon tons of dust. However, there is so much beauty out here where I live that it makes up for all the potential dangers of living out in the desert. Coyotes can be dangerous, and I know they will kill livestock and animals and horses, but one thing I'm not sure about is creatures that suck the blood out of other animals. I'm talking vampires. Okay, well, maybe not vampires in a traditional sense because they are fictional. However, my dad and I are finding wild horses in groups and singular that are dead, with multiple sets of holes along their neck and drained of all blood. I'm talking zero blood in the entire cadaver. There's no blood on the ground, and whatever poked a hole in the neck was so clean and precise. The same sets of holes can be found in the exact same locations on the other horses that we found. We have found deceased horses alone with these puncture wounds, and we have also found them in large groups, all dead. It's almost as if something walked right up to them, poked a hole in their neck, and walked away, and just let them bleed out. Except there's no blood, or evidence of any bleeding out for that matter. I'm not really sure how I'm going to explain it. It's just a weird supernatural phenomenon, because my mind goes to vampires. I have to stop that because it's been programmed that way because of how pop culture is. I know that vampires don't exist, and that there isn't a vampire going around drinking the blood of horses. When I cannot explain is why we're finding these wild horses dead over the past couple of months all of a sudden. It's actually been about the same time that we went into quarantine, so probably late March. Yeah, I would say about 2 months now. I want to say we've been probably finding up to about 30 to 40 dead wild horses in total, all having their blood be drained. I know people talk about UFO stuff, alien stuff, and all that weird abduction nonsense being out in the middle of nowhere, but what even drains the blood of a horse? We are pretty close with our neighbors that are around us, and we've checked in with them. They've been experiencing strange things, but no animals being killed or any blood being drained from anything. The one connection I could piece together potentially is that in the last 60 days, not only has more wild horses been showing up dead more than ever, but the dogs around the area have gone missing. I know that because I've been asked on several occasions already if I had seen several of our neighbors' animals. Animals just meaning dogs. There are the same dogs that I've seen around the area for years. Because I've been here for so long, I've gotten to know my neighbors and people around us very well, and they've had the same animals for a long time. You know, something is up when the same animals just get up and go missing within a 60-day time span. And now, all of a sudden, these horses are just dropping dead in the middle of the night? Something just doesn't add up. I've thought about calling the cops, but really, what are they going to do? If it's somebody doing this, they're going to get caught eventually. But I don't know. Who goes out and murders random wild horses? And you would think if they're kidnapping the dogs, wouldn't you find the dogs somewhere? I guess I'm just thinking out loud at this point. See, my dad is a stickler, just like me, and firmly stands by that it's a coyote. I'm a skeptic just as much as anybody, but even I think that's total bullshit, and that he's just being in denial about something more here. What does more even mean? That is what I'm trying to figure out. Could it be that there is some unknown animal out of the desert draining these horses' blood? Why hasn't anybody seen it? I suppose it's possible for a pack of rabid coyotes to be killing all the local dogs, but I still feel like we would find cadavers with how much my dad and I travel in the outback around here. There's always evidence of a kill. Nature is messy, and few predators go through the lengths to hide their work. Coyotes just simply aren't one of them. Even looking around the area of these horses, there is zero tracks of anything. No boot prints or paw prints. My dad just tells me I'm putting far too much of my mental energy and focus into trying to figure out what's going on. He says I should just let whatever happen, and nature will sort itself out. I don't feel like this is an act of nature, though. I feel like this is something that demands answers. Too many questions and not enough answers, I guess. It's time for me to do some more homework of my own. Hi, what lurks beneath. I just saw your post about the new topic you're going to feature on your channel. I couldn't help but notice you had mentioned the Chupacabra, and I've been waiting for somebody that I can send my little story to, so I guess you'll be the first. This story has to do with my grandfather, and my grandfather's father, who owned big farms and ranches down in Mexico. Both of them claim to have eaten Chupacabra meat, actually, when they were younger, as these beings were frequent visitors on the ranch. My grandfather tells me that it was commonplace to find these creatures drowned in the nearby large pond that the horses and other livestock would drink from. I thought that to be interesting. I wonder what caused them to drown. My grandfather wasn't sure, but his dad and grandfather would just take care of the creature, cut them up, and eat the meat. Said the meat had a weird consistency to it, like it was its own thing. Much the same way seafood and clam meat is still meat, but it's its own thing. There was a time where these creatures became so bad to deal with that they actually had to trick all of them into going into a large barn where the other livestock was. They were somehow able to successfully trap them all inside and then burn the barn down, killing all the Chupacabra inside as well as most of their livestock. My grandfathers are crazy men, and I don't mean crazy up in the head. I mean crazy like they've been through stuff and have mental strength and fortitude to endure. To them, it was just another part of growing up tough and living that lifestyle. When he had first mentioned the whole Chupacabra thing to me, I laughed in his face, but when he sat me down and told me his stories, I was taken aback by them. Anyway, I just wanted to share with you this brief bit of information. I was going to share it with a couple of other big YouTube narrators, but I don't think any of them are really doing Chupacabra-focused content. Oh well, maybe your audience will appreciate my grandfather's experiences. In the spring of 1997, I had to make a trip to Jonesboro, Arkansas. Since I live in Fayetteville, Arkansas, the best way was across Highway 463, across the top of the state. I think that's the highway number. It's the only time I've ever been on that road. Anyway, I finished my business and was returning home that evening. It was around 9 p.m. when I passed through a small town named Salem. With the town behind me, I was once again the only car on the highway. My headlights were bright. The windows were up because I had the heater on, and the radio was playing softly. There was a clearance of maybe 20 feet between the edge of the road and the woods when I noticed what I thought was a tree standing right beside the road. As I got closer, the tree turned and took just a few steps and was at the woods. It was huge and had long, matted hair. Actually, it looked quite nasty. It never looked directly at me. It was slipping into the woods as I passed to the point of it going out of my headlights beam. I stomped on the gas with everything I had and didn't slow down till I was safely in the lights of the next town. As I drove wildly down the highway at 90 miles an hour, that's the fastest the car I was driving would go, I kept looking in the rearview mirror to make sure it wasn't chasing me. I know that sounds nutty, but at the time it seemed like a really good idea. I was perfectly sober at the time. Maybe that should be a lesson to me. I never gave much thought about Bigfoot until that night. Now, I know they exist. I saw one with my own eyes. Anyway, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Late March or early April 2009. Approximately 18:15 hours. I was southbound on GA 75 between Helen and Cleveland, about 0.2 miles north of Duncan Bridge, which is Highway 384. As I rounded a bend, I saw something getting ready to cross the road from east to west. As I slowed, my first thought was that somebody was dressed in a costume, but I dismissed that idea because every pickup around here had a shotgun in the back window, and a good percentage, like myself, had a gun in the car. When he heard me, he stopped on the shoulder. He did not look at me for a few seconds, but then slowly, he turned toward me, looked, then continued to turn 180 degrees and walk into the woods. I was unable to pull off the shoulder and park because of hay bales and plastic used to stop erosion. Traffic was backing up behind me, so I drove to Duncan Bridge, then left on a private road, with the hope of seeing him again. No luck. What I saw, he appeared to be 6'2", 6'4". He was standing erect, but had a slightly hollow chest. His legs and torso seemed normal, as compared to a human, but his arms were longer. His fur was full and sleek. It had a shine to it, a medium light brown. He looked healthy. It was his eyes that I remember the most. He looked at me with an intelligence that you don't see in an animal. The only other time I experienced that was with a dolphin. My husband and I live just outside of Helen. My husband can't sleep very well at night, and as such, he is up at all hours. For about the last 3 weeks, he has heard strange sounds late at night. He has gotten me up several times to listen. Whatever we are hearing is not anything we have ever heard before. All of the dogs go crazy, and whatever it is seems to move very quickly, attracting the dogs as it goes. It is very loud, and it more of a howl or scream. It does not sound like a bobcat or bear or anything else we have heard since living in Northeast Georgia. We have lived in this area for 9 years, and my husband has hunted all of his life, and it used to sound in the night, just not this one. When he woke me up to hear this, we jokingly said, maybe it's a Bigfoot. I got curious as to whether or not there had been any sightings in our area. I was camped about a mile from the shelter and was enjoying myself when I suddenly felt uneasy and decided to go to a omitted shelter where a man on the trail said other people were camping. As I went about 50 yards from where I was camping, I surprised something that I did not see, but it took off down the side of a cliff, and I just assumed it was a bear. When I got to the shelter, just after dark, I set up in the shelter. About 5:30 a.m., I heard a very loud, high-pitched howling sound, twice. That was like nothing I have ever heard or seen on TV. The first howl sounded like it was answered by the second, that was not quite as loud. I sat straight up and thought, what was that? I did not go back to sleep. It did not sound even close to any animal I have ever heard. It was about 11 p.m., and we had just laid down to sleep. We were staying in a cabin that we had rented for the weekend. I heard this high-pitched, horrific scream. It was close. It was not some faint, distant sound. It was very clear and very close. My first thought was a woman in distress, and then, about 20 seconds later, I heard it again. I also heard dogs barking above me, higher up on the ridge. This time, I realized it was probably not a human. The sound was forceful, deliberate, high-pitched, reverberating scream. Because I was inside the cabin, it is hard to tell how far away this was. I would guess within 750 feet, perhaps as close as 200 feet. The scream continued for about 4 or 5 more times, repeating every 25 seconds. I have military and hunting experience and have never heard such a sound. I cannot think of an animal that can make this type of sound. I will never forget it, that's for sure. I was sitting on my couch watching TV with my small dogs around me. My male Yorkie saw it when I went out our back door. It was still daylight. I thought it was a man at first, but it was too large, too dark, and fleeting. The dog jumped up and ran to the back door, but I moved slowly over there, being a little frightened. When I looked out the door, it was gone. My first impression of it being a man was because of the general shape, but the dark figure wasn't wearing clothes and had to be well over 10 feet tall, just to see it through the doorway like I did. I was able to see the upper body from where I was sitting. The porch drops off with the stairway to the patio around the pool. That's where it was walking, rapidly, next to the house. By the time I got to the door to look out, it was over the fence and gone. My instinct was to check the gate, and I saw it was still latched and locked, never having been opened. It wasn't a human. It was too large. It wasn't a bear. It was running upright. I can't come up with any other thing that could be that tall and that could do what it did. And having seen what I saw in 1999, I don't take this very lightly. It was June 15th, 1997, Father's Day. My friends and I had been rock climbing at Raven Cliff Falls in the Chattahoochee National Forest, just outside of Helen, Georgia. After climbing all day Friday and Saturday morning, a rainstorm made us pull down our rigging and head out of the woods. We drove down to Helen and walked around until about 5 p.m. We filled up the truck and headed back towards Raven Cliff to find a campsite for the night. We found a small dirt road that had been barricaded with a large dirt brim. We drove over the berm and drove into the forest. We drove until we had half a tank of gas, which put us several miles back in. Around 11 or 11:30 p.m., we found a small clearing and decided to stop and make camp. Once we exited our truck, we found a shallow hole that was about 3 to 4 feet in diameter that appeared to be an old fire pit. It had a large log laying on one side of it. We gathered wood for a fire and began to set up camp. Since the weather was nice, we decided to not mess with tents and hammocks. After about 30 minutes of lying down, I heard a noise in the tree line on the left side of our camp. It sounded like an animal moving through the brush. I dismissed it and tried to go back to sleep. I continued to hear the noise for several minutes. I've spent a lot of time in the woods, hiking and camping. The next thing I heard was nothing I had ever heard before. I heard a grunt and then a scream that did not sound like any other animal. It sounded like it came from maybe 50 to 100 yards away. I asked what it was, and my friends did not have an answer. We began kidding around, saying that we were out a good way, and it could be a Sasquatch. I did not go to sleep for a while after that scream. Finally, I drifted to sleep and slept until daybreak. As we got up to get our gear packed, we noticed prints next to the fire that none of us had ever seen before. They definitely were not human, but were too big for any animal known to be in an indigenous to that area. We quickly loaded up and left the area. It was on Thanksgiving night in 1999. I was driving home from my daughter's apartment in Cleveland, Georgia, when suddenly I thought I saw a man crossing the road on Highway 75. I hit my brakes and realized that it was wearing no clothes and was covered in hair like a bear, but it walked upright and hunched more like a man or a huge ape-like thing. It was definitely not a bear. It was large and long-armed. It turned its head and looked over at me, then swiftly jumped down a huge drop and disappeared into the woods. It all happened so fast. I was shocked and went home, not sure of what I believed I had seen at the moment. Before then, I had never been sure if something like that had existed, and I tried to rationalize what I had seen. But now, I am convinced that it was, in fact, neither man, nor bear, nor simple ape. I cannot prove what it actually was, but I can say that it was quite amazing. Either that night or the next morning, I called animal control, saying that I saw a bear, believing that it wouldn't be taken serious if I said what I know that I saw. There were cattle nearby that needed protection. In May of 1993, some of my friends of mine and I decided to go trout fishing above Helen, Georgia. After fishing for a couple of hours, one guy and I decided to go upriver to find some new spots. So we started walking up an old roadbed that followed along the river. We eventually got to a spot where there was a gully across the road. At one time, there must have been a bridge. While me and my friend were standing there, we heard a loud thud behind us. As we turned around, there was a big 10-foot log, about the diameter of a car tire, lying there. Take into account just a second ago, that log was not there. We climbed over the log and started to head back down the road when all of a sudden, we heard leaves shuffling above us. Both my friend and I had a strange feeling as we looked at each other. At the same time, we both looked up above us, and there was a Bigfoot standing 10 to 15 feet from us. We hauled ass out of there. We finally made it back to where our other friends were and told them what happened. They wanted to go see. The guy that was with me said no and went back to the vehicle. I took the other two guys to show them, and on the way there, we saw a footprint in the mud that looked like somebody walking barefoot, except it was approximately 18 inches in length. We walked back and saw nothing else. I'm 6'3" and 290 pounds, and this thing dwarfed me big time. It was at least 9 feet tall and about 4 feet across at the shoulders. It had to weigh around 800 pounds. It really looked like a big human covered in long, shaggy black hair. The thing that got me was its reddish brown eyes. It took years for me to go back up there fishing, and when I did, I would not go alone. It's weird because sometimes when you're up there, you feel safe, but other times I feel like something is watching you. Since then, I have heard wood knocking, vocalizations, and had rocks thrown at me. I do not hesitate to go up there anymore, but I will not go alone. I have a personal experience that would like to relate. I would hesitate to call it an encounter because it was dark and from an undetermined distance. Somewhere between 30 to 50 yards, and it was on an elevated plane to us. Just outside of Helen, off of SR 75, north of the upper Chattahoochee River recreation area. If you go to the top of the mountain, north of the park clearing, that's where my experience was. I had my first experience there in the year of 1990, while a group of 5 friends and I were walking late at night. We saw something on a bridge, and it stood up, clearly visible, but only as a silhouette in the moonlight, and jumped a very large distance. It then seemed to stride over the backside of the ridge away from us. It was actually very quiet. It didn't make a sound before we saw it stand, and we didn't hear it land or stride away, as if it was stalking or observing us. Of course, we were all extremely scared after seeing it initially. Again, it was at night, and far away so that we couldn't get a clear description, but we all saw it, and were all struck with a panic like fear. I also went back with my dad, who was a very harsh skeptic, in the summer of 2006. We did not see anything, but I had noted a couple of other things at this later date. It was summer. First, there was a very strong odor that seemed to hang in a centralized area the entire weekend. Secondly, the park rangers came by to tell us that the night before, in the same place we were camping, last people left food out, went into town after nightfall, and returned to find the camp completely ransacked. So we needed to pack our food up, or better yet, keep it in the vehicles back on the road. They said the bears were foraging and getting brave because of the onset of the drought. Again, no sightings, but interesting because nobody actually spotted the bear either. And lastly, along the mountain road at a height of about 10 feet off the ground, there was a 4-inch sapling wrung and twisted completely around. My dad once spent 3 months in the woods living off the land in the late 70s in North Georgia. It's the #1 reason he is skeptical, he says. That long in the woods, and he would have seen something if it was out there. But when I noticed the odor and asked him if it was a skunk, he said no, not really. More likely a wet bear that got sprayed by a skunk, but it had a more dank odor than just skunk. And also, when I pointed out the wrung tree and asked him what it could have possibly been, he had no clue. I work in agricultural marketing. My job is to determine the amount of meat that will be derived from individual cow carcasses after slaughter, and before they are split into primal cuts. To determine this, we have to compare the conformation of the animal, or the ratio of muscling to fat, and factor in the skeletal structure of the animal. So, if I apply this to what I remember seeing when I was younger, this creature was absolutely huge, at least 8 feet tall, and weighing easily around 550 pounds. It was tall, but had a slightly more narrow build in the shoulder area width than the animal in the Patterson film. It was still too large to be a human, wider and thicker muscled than a man, but not as stocky as the Patterson footage. That is why I say it may not be heavier. I will try to explain what I saw. While returning home from a day of walking in a clear cut looking for Indian artifacts, The clear cut was located at the foot of the southeast end of the Horse Range Mountain near Loudsville Campground in White County, Georgia. I was driving on a Forestry Service road when I saw what at first I thought was a bear about 200 yards away. But when I stopped and watched it, I saw that it was not. It walked upright with a slight stoop for about 75 yards down a hill toward a small creek that was bordered by trees and brush. The road crossed the creek, so I thought if I went down on the road, I could see it as it came out the other side. But it did not come out, and I did not get out of the Bronco to go looking for it. I did not hear any sound, and to be honest, I did not tell anybody about it for years until I told my son Eric. I went out in a Pigeon on 9/27/11, and what I heard wasn't any animals I'm used to hearing on Pigeon Mountain. It was a deep growl, and then a long mellow scream, and I heard the same noise below my house. I live just about 3 miles from Pigeon Mountain on Moon Lake Road, where a couple months ago I heard the same scream on Saddleline Road below where I live. I'm going back to Pigeon Mountain tomorrow night and try to see if I hear it again. 2 friends of mine and myself were pushing a cave lead in Cornfield Sink on the east side of Pigeon Mountain. We came out of the lead at about 3 a.m. and started gathering our caving gear together for the half-mile walk to the car. As we were about to leave, the strangest call I have ever heard came from the opposite side of the sink from us. Distance would have been about 900 feet. The 3 of us have been woodsmen all of our lives, but none of us have ever heard a call like that. It sounded like 4 different animals in one, all powered by what must have been an enormous set of lungs. Hearing the vocalization, the 3 of us looked at each other, saucer-eyed and not saying a word. Each of us was hoping the others would pipe up with a logical explanation for what we heard. Needless to say, since we had been planning to leave anyway, we beat a hasty retreat to the vehicles. Hi. Me and my friend have been hearing some weird stuff while we were hunting. My friend heard the sounds first. Then I heard them the next evening, right before dark. The sounds sound like something is screaming, but kind of high-pitched screams. My friend also thought he heard something throwing stuff around his tree stand. The reason I think it is a Bigfoot is because there is some property behind ours, and they have been clear-cutting all of it. I think it has run the Bigfoot onto our property. If I see anything else or hear anything else, I will give you more information. My girlfriend and I traveled to this area at 11:30 that night to build a campfire and relax from the daily grind. She and I didn't have to work Wednesday, so the late hour didn't matter. At about 11:30, we found a suitable site approximately 7 to 8 miles in. There are only a dozen or so clearings for camping on the trail. Our site was on the trail, a clearing big enough to circle my truck around. It had 2 other trails at the back corners. One didn't go far before growth took over. The other looked like it might be passable, as far as I could tell. At 1 a.m., I was sitting on the tailgate and my girlfriend a few feet away tending the fire. Then we heard a loud, high-pitched scream that reverberated through the dense forest. My girlfriend got scared and asked me what it was. I have been an outdoorsman my whole life, hunting, fishing, camping, and studying animals like a religion. I've never heard of anything like that can scream. I told my girlfriend to be quiet, and maybe it would go off again. The moon was high and bright, to be full, not yet. The trail was lit good, so I looked down the trail and I looked the way we came. In the middle of the trail, a large, bulky figure stood. The way the light fell on its features, I believe it was facing me from about 30 yards distant. I thought at first it might be a tree or bush, but it had a discernible head, arms, torso, and legs. I went and got my girlfriend, not saying anything to upset her. If it turned out to be a tree, she would be mad for teasing her. I looked and the figure was gone. Back at the fire, the animal behind us screamed, same as before, except this time it sounded just inside the forest cover. Before we could react, a similar, more distant call came from the forest in front of us. Was this the thing I had seen? I don't know. At that, I threw everything in the truck and at my girlfriend's panic. I shoveled sand onto the fire while she screamed hurry. I jumped into the truck and hid out a lot faster than we ever drove in. I was deer hunting on Pigeon Mountain and was following a group of deer when I shot and wounded an almost solid black buck with a large rack. The buck followed a well-worn game trail, and I had trailed the deer by blood drops. It was getting dark, and the terrain was getting difficult to continue, and I had no light. I had to turn and come down the mountain. I began to feel like I was not alone. There were none of the normal animal sounds, like birds and squirrels, etc. I had heard something coming down the mountain, taking a parallel path that I was taking. I could not see anything. There were limbs breaking, leaves rustling, and then I would hear nothing. I had unloaded my gun for safety and reloaded because I had never heard an animal move through the woods like this one. Myself, one other person, and the owner were the only people allowed to hunt in the area, and the terrain it was using was too rough for a human to travel, much less move at the speed this animal was. 1 minute, it would sound like a raging bull, and the next minute, it would move down the mountain, not making a sound. I heard a grunt and a growl. I was terrified and felt as I was being stalked by something I had never encountered before. When I stopped, so did it. When I moved slow, it moved slow. When I moved faster, it moved faster. I was worried when I would hear nothing. I reached the base of the mountain and had taken a wrong turn and had put myself in front of a large briar patch. It did not let that stop me. I drove through the briars, cutting and scratching myself. I finally reached the safety of my truck and once again heard the grunting noise from behind me. I did not return to look for the buck I had shot or ever hunt in that area again. I did not ever see anything, but something large was in the woods that night. I have not felt safe in the woods since. I had hunted, fished, and farmed in that area all of my life. I felt as though I knew all the animals in the woods and the sounds they made as they moved. I was taught to stalk, hunt by an employee who worked on our farm, and he had lived in the Smoky Mountains and fed his family by hunting game. I had heard deer grunt before, and this was no deer grunting. My name is Amber Lee, and I live here in Asheville, North Carolina, with my dog, Captain. Captain is the love of my life. He's an Alaskan Klekai Husky with a mostly black coat, but with streaks of white fur around his legs and face, not to mention little rings of dark fur around his pale blue eyes that make him kind of look like the Hamburglar. I rescued him from a shelter when he was just a puppy, right after my fiancé moved out to Hong Kong for work. He helped me through the initial loneliness on nights when I just couldn't handle getting into an empty bed for the 50th time, and in the years that followed when my husband decided he would be better off starting a family with a Chinese woman he met through his job. Captain helped me through the heartbreak. Captain is a big guy, a subwoofer. While other dogs need walks, Captain needs hikes. Which is why, every weekend for the past few years, I would drive him out to a national forest, Nantala to be exact. One of the few places he could really be. Dogs just aren't meant to be cooped up indoors. They need to run, they need to explore, they need a place like this. And coincidentally, so did I. This national forest was a place I could really lose myself, a place to escape the pressure of high-pressure, high-paying job. The woods were a place of sanctuary to me, but that all changed one chilly October day when I came to realize that there is a damned good reason why human beings have walled themselves off in towns and cities, because the wilderness, it seems, is not our friend. Captain was always his happiest in the woods, For such a majestic animal, he has an uncanny ability to act goofy as hell, and the woods brought that out of him in spades. He'd be so lost in the feeling of pure freedom, his blue eyes all wide with his tongue lolling out to one side of his mouth, riding the wave of zoomies that inevitably had me laughing at how dorky he acted. So, you could imagine how quickly I noticed a change in his behavior, how he went from being such a loud, boisterous dog to a quivering, whining wreck that barely ventured a few feet away from me at any one time. And all the time I'd been taking Captain out to this forest, I'd never seen him act in such a way. And when I laid a hand on his neck to give him a stroke, I discovered he was actually trembling in fear. My first thought was that a mountain lion could have been in the area, but a previous encounter with what I'd figure was a predator's scent trail had caused Captain to bark incessantly and become overly aggressive. Now, this was back in the fall of last year, and that during the previous summer, the National Forest had seen a sharp increase in black bear activity, with homeowners being encouraged to be much more careful. Surrounding issues of food disposal, it was entirely possible that Captain had sniffed out a mama bear and cubs, in which he was outright terrified. I had no idea what to make of such a situation, but one thing was clear though. Captain wanted out, and consequently, so did I. There was only one big problem with such a plan. We'd already spent like 2 hours hiking in the woods. Getting out would not be quick or easy. With every step, the tension grew. Captain looking behind me with wild, terrified eyes, darting ahead before doubling back to whine at me. Each footstep seemed a little quicker than the last, my utter paranoia growing to fever pitch as I continually looked behind me and continually saw nothing. But something was behind us. Captain knew it, and I could feel it. At one point, he bounded back to my side and froze, staring off into the dense forest as he sniffed at the air before him. I thought the worst was over, but I was horribly, horribly wrong. With a yelp so loud, it hurt my ears. He burst off through the trees ahead, howling barks punctuating his canine gallop. That's when I heard it, a rustling in the trees behind me, and with a terror so rampant, I could still feel it to this day. I heard something behind me breathing, and it was huge. I just ran, following the sound of Captain's barks, crashing through the dense trees as dry branches tore at the bare skin on my face. There are many times in my life where I'd been uncomfortable, anxious, or scared. This experience dwarfed them all. No emotion can compare to that knowing you're being hunted by something that you cannot reason or bargain with. Something that will crunch your bones into meal and not feel a damned thing. I ran harder and longer than I ever have in my life. So intensely that when I finally had to stop to draw breath, I found myself dry retching against a tree trunk, out of exhaustion, out of fear, out of pure biological imperative, making me as light and mobile as possible. But there could be no respite. Captain's furious barks made that abundantly clear. We had to keep moving. It was that or be eaten alive. With tears in my eyes, I carried on running, hurtling through the forest, the thickets so dense I was running half blind, which was made painfully obvious when I caught my foot on a fallen tree trunk and was set flying into the dirt. The impact alone knocked the wind out of me with an ugly grunt, and as I rolled onto my back, struggling for breath, I saw Captain appear at my side. He had been my hero so many times before, and wasn't about to fail me now. His barks were wild, full of rage, his sharp teeth exposed as he poured the raw force of his being into the woods behind us. It was terrifying, awe-inspiring to behold, and in that moment, I thanked God that he was on my side. But not even Captain could maintain the display, for when the unseen thing hunting us seemed to roar back through the trees, Captain was silenced. He rushed over to me, taking the collar of my waterproof coat between his teeth and trying to drag me along the forest floor. But I was renewed, by terror, by biological imperative, by the damn raw need to survive. In an instant, I was back on my feet, running, panting, scrambling for life. I remember there being a moment when I was terrified that Captain might leave me, how the fear might prove too much for him to handle. There was so much of the forest for him to escape into, but he never once failed to double back and find me. Even when he was out of sight, he made sure to continue barking furiously, so I'd know exactly where to run to. That was until I burst through a set of particularly thick bushes to find Captain, stood stationary at a riverbank. It wasn't all that wide, or all that deep, but it was enough of an obstacle to halt his progress. You see, Captain hated water. I don't know if it was something that happened to him as a puppy before we adopted him from the shelter, but Captain has always hated water. Pools, rivers, lakes. You couldn't get him to go within 6 feet of any of them, which is why seeing that river in our way terrified me on a whole new level. Out of pure instinct, I just jumped across. Like I said, it wasn't particularly wide, but the exhaustion of running for so long meant I only barely made the jump. I turned, knowing that Captain wouldn't even attempt the jump without encouragement or direction. My voice was trembling as I spoke. "Come on, boy, jump to mama. Please, boy, please jump, mama, come on." It was horrendous, watching his eyes so full of confusion, saying without words, "Why are you making me do this?" I watched him pacing up and down the bank as the thing hunted us grew closer and closer. In the end, I was begging him, pleading with him, promising steak dinners for an entire year, if he would only get his ass across the river. For a moment, he froze, sizing up the gap before sprinting off back among the trees. Again, that terrified feeling gripped me. He couldn't do it. He was so terrified of the water that in a moment of pure panic, he'd fled back in the direction of the thing chasing us. It felt like an eternity, standing there on the riverbank, praying that he'd reappear, somehow convincing myself that he wouldn't. Only he did. In one glorious moment, he burst from the foliage, hurtling towards the river's edge at breakneck speed. As he reached the bank, his legs unfurled like springs, sending him sailing through the air, high above the river. It's funny the little details you remember from a traumatic event, and one of the things that sticks with me are Captain's eyes as he jumped that river. They were huge, these massive pale blue circles that seemed to shine out from rings of black fur around them, almost like he couldn't quite believe what he was doing, and quite frankly, neither could I. I mean it when I say he was like an action hero in some hyperbolic 80s movie. The bravery he displayed is something I feel I can only aspire to. Even his landing was dramatic as hell. He barely made it across and was scrambling up the dirt embankment when I leapt towards him, grabbed him by the collar, and pulled him onto the solid ground. When we were up, he took off again with renewed speed, seemingly more terrified of the water than whatever had been stalking us. I'd had tears in my eyes before, but at that point, I broke down completely, calling after him with staggered breathing. "Good boy, Captain. Good boy." I continued to run, feeling my thighs burn and my feet ache from what felt like miles upon miles of it. I was so short of breath, so damn exhausted. I thought I might just pass out at any moment. And when I say I could literally hear my own heart beating in my throat, I'm not exaggerating in the slightest. I am not an unfit person either. I dance a lot, I take a spin class, I have stamina. But running at almost constant sprint for the better part of an hour made it feel like my heart was about to explode out of my chest. By the time I'd reached the peak of yet another gentle incline, my legs gave out from under me. I remember seeing silvery white patches appearing in my vision, and no matter how hard I drew breath, I just couldn't seem to get enough oxygen. When I saw something and moving in front of me, something that definitely wasn't Captain, I thought that was it. I thought I'd pass out and never wake up again, having been torn apart by whatever wild animal was chasing us. I woke up in the back seat of a 4-seater pickup truck. As soon as I found the strength to sit up, I heard a voice outside the stationary vehicle shout, "She's awake." Suddenly, the door opened, and a person I'd never seen before in my life was offering me a plastic bottle of water and asking if I was okay. I didn't speak. I just took the water off of him and gulped like 3/4 of it down in one long, sweet chug. By the time I regained my senses, I was panicking. I couldn't see Captain anywhere. I looked at the stranger, dressed in his hunting gear, and tried to summon the strength to ask him where my dog was. Although the words just wouldn't come out. The look on my face must have told him all he needed to know. When he told me Captain was fine, and he was just inside their hunting lodge getting a bite to eat. I just cried with relief. I was overjoyed he was okay, but that's not what made me burst into tears. The hunter told me that, for a while, Captain wouldn't follow any of them out to the truck, no matter how much meat they offered him. He just stayed at my side, yapping and whining, waiting for me to wake up. For a couple of hours, I joined the hunters in their lodge, eating the hamburger they offered me, slowly, while I regained my strength. I told them exactly what had happened, how Captain had freaked out after we stumbled across what I assumed was a black bear. But black bears are relatively small, certainly not as big as grizzlies, and certainly not as big as whatever had been chasing us to the woods. I raised the issue with them and asked them what they thought it might be. I thought they might have an answer, being seasoned hunters, but they didn't. There was this awkward silence as they exchanged looks, before one of them spoke up, telling me they just didn't know. I asked if it was possible that a grizzly bear could make it this far down from the Rockies, with one responding that it was possible. But that was a lie. An outright lie. Those hunters quite possibly saved my life, and for that I will be eternally grateful. But I know they lied to me. Grizzlies don't make it anywhere near North Carolina at any time of the year. I've done a fair amount of research into what was chasing that day, but I've been unable to come up with anything conclusive. The only thing I know for sure is that those hunters were hiding something, and as long as they do, people will continue to go missing in that stretch of North Carolina woodland. Captain is lying next to my computer chair as I write this, ever faithful and ever watchful. And in my darkest moments, I wonder how I'm ever going to last without him. About 5 years ago, me and my older sister went to a nature park, a wetland, so to speak. Of course, we went at night so we could skateboard around, because you aren't allowed to. But, in front of her 24-year-old sister. Well, we just went around as the sun was setting. For a little bit, we got lost since the park was so huge and condensed with the thick woods. We were trying to find the bridge, a 20-foot or so bridge so we can hang out just above the rushing river. By the time we got there, the sun was hardly visible over the mountains. I looked around after drinking my water, and here is where the creepy stuff happened. As I looked at the other side of the bridge, I saw a tall, skinny figure. I first shrugged it off like it was a person, maybe a ranger of the park, but then it got on all fours and walked away. I didn't say anything at first, mainly because I thought it was maybe a bear. I looked back at my sister as we chatted about boys and along many other things. Then I looked back at the end of the bridge. My sister did too, and we both saw the figure this time. At this point, I was totally freaked out. Mind you, it's still not dark out. The sky was purple and orange, so it wasn't like we were seeing things that when your mind pictures figures in the dark. No, it was right there, getting closer. I told my sister to get the hell out of there. Her going first off the bridge and down the hill. I went second, and as I turned to look at the bridge again, it was 5 feet in front of me, on all fours once again. It stood there as me and my sister skated off, and this isn't even the end. I told my sister to head to the main building since there's cameras and lots of lights. We skateboarded for what seemed like hours. Every minute seemed to last an eternity. As we finally get to the main building, we finally stopped riding our boards. Out of breath and scared, we both looked around, and by this time, it was pitch black outside. We made a mad dash to the car, taking a path we have never seen before, but it was outside the park, which made us feel safer. After we got to my sister's Jeep, we both got in, hearts racing and scared out of our minds, and when we tried to leave the gate, it was locked, meaning we couldn't leave since there was only one way in and out of the park. We got even more scared. We tried everything to get out. We even thought about just leaving the car behind and walking the 2 hours home. But we drove onto the sidewalk and got out of the park. To this day, I won't ever go back into those wetlands ever again, even in daylight. Whatever that thing was, I never want to see it again. I can't stop thinking about it, and I'm almost 19. You can think this is just a story, but it really did happen. Me and my sister don't even talk about it to this day. Something changed between us. I could feel it after that very day. I'd like to start off by saying my parents live on a plantation in the middle of nowhere in Mississippi. I won't say specifically where due to privacy. Growing up, it was me and my brother, who is 4 years older than I, and he's still my best friend to this day. My dad was a farmer, so me and my brother both grew up with a love for the outdoors and adventure. We have over 7,000 acres and a total of 6 barns. My grandparents owned this land before my father inherited it. They owned slaves, and my grandfather treated them all well and even built a small community for them behind our barns so they would be close by in case they were needed. It's the 21st century, so we had no slaves. We had upgraded to farmhands by this point when I was a kid. I was 6 years old at the time of this encounter, and my brother was 10. My mother had just passed away, and it was just us 3 left. We were out one day exploring the barn. My dad was out in the fields tilling to prepare the crops we had coming in. We ended up down in the community, which was about 2 miles or so from our house, which consisted of 7 houses that were out in the woods. By this time, they were overgrown and underkept due to their lack of tenants who were in charge of upkeep. To give you a bit of insight into how these looked, I will try my best to give you a brief explanation. There were all wooden houses, 1 story of course, with a small porch and a large wooden door. They had 2 windows on each side of the front door, and windows all along the sides, all broken. The grass was waist high, and the tree limbs had broken into the windows, and some had even grown into the sides of one house. My brother was carrying a machete to chop away some of the undergrowth so we could get to them. We entered the front house that was a bit bigger than the rest, with tin on the roof and a brick chimney. The steps broke under our feet, and my brother had to help me climb up. The porch had almost completely rotted by this point. I'm not a tall girl, and my legs are especially short, making high cabinets and big steps difficult for me, even now. My brother went first, opening the door with a heavy kick from the wood being warped and disfigured. He shut the door best he could behind us. We entered the house to see most of the floor was missing, revealing grass and even small trees growing through the floor. Rodents scattered in every direction, making me yelp, but my brother just laughed. There was a mattress to the left that springs were the only thing remaining. All of a sudden, we heard a loud crack right outside the door, causing both of us to freeze where we were. My brother whispered that it was probably a deer and to be super quiet so we could see him. We both slowly crept over to one of the windows to try to see outside and catch the deer. We both had a love for animals and enjoyed watching them. As we reached the window, we heard a very hushed voice, and I very distinctly remember the deep growl of one of the voices telling the other, "Shut up. I don't know where they went, but I swear to God, when we find them, we'll kill all of them. I don't care. I'll kill them before I go to jail." Then he erupted into maniacal laughter that echoed through the woods. I remember the look on my brother's face. I knew he was terrified. My brother was only 10 at the time, but he was almost 6 feet, and almost nothing scared him. If he was scared, I knew I should be. He whispered for me to crouch down so he couldn't be seen through the window. I crept down next to a rotten couch that reeked of decay. The smell alone made me gag. Tears were spilling out of my eyes, and I kept my hands over my mouth to keep my sobs quiet. I bit down so hard on my hand, I remember tasting blood. My brother was peering over the side of the window, his face white. I heard limbs breaking as the trespassers were making their way towards every house to find us. I remember thanking God that my brother had shut the door. He motioned me to come towards him, and I slowly crept to where he was, trying to make as little as noise as possible. He told me he was going to open the door, and when he did, then I needed to run all the way back to the house and try to find Dad. He kept nudging me towards the door and was getting frustrated when I wouldn't move. I heard one of the men tell the other one to check the big building, and my heart froze. The house we were in was significantly bigger than the others, and I knew they were coming for us. We heard sticks snapping from every direction, and in my child's mind, I knew we were going to die. Nothing is scarier than thinking you're going to die at such a young age. I was absolutely terrified. I was behind my brother against the wall, and he was holding my hand. I remember how sweaty his shaking hand was and how fast his heart was beating. He had the machete brandished like some sword in a sci-fi movie, and I almost chuckled at the sight. As scared as I was, the door to the house was kicked open, and there stood 4 men, standing about 6 feet or so in height. They all looked like they hadn't bathed in years, and I could smell them from where they were standing. They smelt of rotten meat and body odor. Their teeth were yellowing, some missing, and they looked like they had been beat up, covered in bruises and blood. The blonde guy in the front was the first to speak. His voice still terrorizes me to this day. "Well, look at what we have here. A knight in shining armor, and what a damn princess." He had laughed. My brother spoke in the deepest voice he could manage. This is my dad's land. You better get out. He's got guns and he'll shoot you." The blonde guy chuckled, shaking his head, and took a step towards us. The next thing he said chilled me to my core. "Your daddy can't save you. No one can. I'm your god now." He said as he took another step towards us. He looked over at me, and my blood went cold. He smiled, and I could see he only had one front tooth, and only a few were left in his menacing smile. "I love pretty blonde girls. I'd love to take you with me, my own pretty little girl. I've always wanted one." I cried out and buried my face into my brother's back as I wept, screaming for my dad. "Daddy can't save you now," he screamed, and my brother lunged toward the guy and swung the machete as hard as he could, almost knocking himself over from its weight. All 3 of the guys started laughing maniacally. My brother stepped closer to the men swinging the machete again, coming inches from the blonde guy's face. He leaned back to avoid the blow and started only laughing louder. The sound was like something out of the most awful horror movie. I could hear the crackling in their voices. Their smiles made it all the more worse. All 3 of the men were in the house with us now, and the lanky black-haired guy shut the door behind him. They kept inching closer to us, and my brother was telling me to stay behind him as he kept the machete pointed towards them. Then, the most heavenly sound. Out of nowhere, we heard a truck horn, and my heart jumped into my throat. The road leading to the community was maybe 200 yards from the house, with few trees between it. The guys went stock straight and bolted out the door. One of their legs fell through the floor, but he quickly yanked it out and bolted. We looked out to see my dad and cousins jumping out of his truck with all their guns in hand. They fired a few shots, missing the men by only inches. My dad ran into the house and scooped me up. My brother was crying, and my dad was too. He hugged me and my brother so tight that day. My dad never let us go near the community again, and only let us go into the barns if he was with us. He told me recently he thought he were dead already, and he will never be happier than the day he found us alive. As for the guys, after my dad and cousins arrived, they bolted deeper into the woods, and my cousins pursued them but gave up after a mile or so. My cousin still swears he shot one of them in the leg, but it was never confirmed. My dad told my brother he was coming to the barn for a drink, and to the rest for a minute, and heard my screams, and they immediately followed them to us. My brother and I both received intense counseling for the next few months afterwards. I'm 22 years old now, and I still wake up in a panic, reliving the worst day of my life with those awful men. I am so thankful for my brother for doing his best to keep me alive. I'm even more thankful for my dad and cousins, and that they had given the fields a rest, even if just for a moment. God only knows what would have happened to us had they not shown up. It scares me to this day to think about it. At night, while in the process of going to sleep or waking up from sleep, I have experienced, and will presumably continue to experience, the phenomenon known as sleep paralysis, paired with appearances from what I've come to know as shadow people. This is not a fictionalized creepypasta, nor any kind of bait and switch, me and my buddies saw this thing in the woods type of writing. I certify that everything in this writing is true in the sense that I've personally experienced it. This is not intended to be in any way funny. I am dead serious. I think that reading this may be disturbing for some, so please note that this is a warning. Let me start by noting that I am in no way superstitious and have a strictly scientific worldview. I don't believe in any kind of supernatural, ghosts, gods, angels, demons, the paranormal, or cryptozoology, or anything that would lead me to a supernatural explanation for these things. My current dominant hypothesis is that my brain, being the incredibly complex machine that it is, functions somewhat poorly during the shutdown wake-up cycles and creates these things for me to experience, and that they are only hallucinations. When I speak of the shadow people as they, or him, or her, what I really mean is the human-shaped hallucination that my brain created for me. Also, I'm not sure if this is related or not, but I occasionally experience absence seizures. When this happens, I begin to feel extremely lightheaded, then overheated and nauseated, and then I see stars near the edges of my vision. Then the stars close in and fill my vision. I collapse. I become non-lucid and non-responsive, and I can only hear the environment around me in distorted frequencies. This usually only goes on for a few minutes, though it is hard to tell me while I'm like this. It happens about 2 to 3 times per year and can be triggered by perceived mental stressors. This started when I hit puberty and is still ongoing. In the most plain of terms, something about my brain is messed up and has serious malfunctions at times. I am aware of it though. You might think me less sane after reading this though. The occurrences of sleep paralysis and shadow people, hallucinations, started when I was in my early 20s and I was in college, probably around 2007. I was living in an apartment with a roommate, and when I wasn't getting dead drunk, I would routinely stay up for extended periods, 30 plus hours or more, to get my class assignments done on time. The repeat alcohol ingestion and sleep deprivation, in hindsight, represent risk factors that I now believe trigger these. Based on my own experiences, other risk factors for me include use of any kind of stimulants or depressants, or psychotropic drugs, high stress levels, and emotional and psychological instability. On one typical evening, I was in the process of waking up from a midday nap in the apartment. I had abused caffeine and sugar to push myself to finish a class assignment overnight, and naturally needed to catch up on lost sleep. I had fallen asleep on my bed in my street clothes. It was the kind of sleep that one gets after staying up for way too long. The best kind. I was lying on my back and beginning to drift towards consciousness, but wasn't fully awake yet. An in-between state. In this half-dreaming, half-awake state, I suddenly began to experience two very new things. A feeling of intense, icy fear, and the feeling of a presence being in the room with me with malicious intent. As I looked toward the end of my bed, I saw a shadowy figure standing silently at the opposite side of the room. Judging from its form, it appeared to be a young adult male. The strangest thing about the figure was that it had no discernible features, instead of just being an icy black silhouette with poorly defined edges, almost like more of a shadow than a physical object in and of itself. The figure then moved toward the foot of my bed, stopped, and simply stared at me, all the while projecting an extremely threatening presence through its body language. As this was happening, I felt that I needed to move to a sitting position and to tell this person to get the hell out of my room and leave my apartment. But strangely, found that I could not. I couldn't move, speak, or do anything except move my eyes to follow the movement of the figure, and was forced to lay completely still in a state of intense, paralyzing fear. The situation became extremely personally invasive and upsetting as the figure had moved slowly from the end of my bed to a position directly beside me, standing over me, well inside of my personal space. I was still unable to do anything about it but breathe heavily and sweat. In that moment, I wanted absolutely nothing but for the figure to go away and leave me alone. I jolted awake in an instant, gasping for air, convinced that there was somebody in the room with me. So I took out my pocket knife. I always have one in my pocket in my street clothes, waved it around in the near darkness, and screamed at the perceived intruder to tell them to get out of my room, and stumbled to the light switch. After turning on the lights, there was no sign of the mysterious figure. I repeatedly searched the small apartment for any sign of entry or disturbance. I found no sign of my roommate, and no sign of any intruder either. Being a skeptic, I also immediately began questioning the reality of the experience and my perceptions. Had it been a nightmare? I hadn't felt like a nightmare, yet I obviously hadn't been fully awake either. It had felt more like a mixed reality, as though between waking and dream states. Clearly, this was something new and different. Waking up from this experience and mentally processing this was disorientating and upsetting, to say the least. I went to the bathroom, splashed some cold water on my face, and talked aloud to myself to mentally reinforce what I was doing, and fully regained my orientation and sense of reality. Later, after my roommate got home, I asked him why the hell he had been in my room while I was trying to sleep, and why he had just stood over my bed like that. I told him that he had seriously scared the hell out of me, and asked him not to do anything like that ever again. He said he didn't know what I was talking about, and that he wasn't home at the time. I said that I must have had a real serious nightmare, and went on about my business for the day. At this point, I thought that I might be going insane. I had never seen anything in my life that would not easily be explained by my existing scientific worldview, but simultaneously could not explain the bizarre and upsetting experience that I had just had. In my mind, I very quickly searched for any and all existing references to anything that could explain what I had just seen, no matter how ridiculous, and assembled a number of competing hypotheses: hallucination, nightmare, mental malfunction, someone drugged me, someone broke into the apartment while I was asleep, ghosts, demons, alien abduction, interdimensional beings, out-of-body experiences, and the list went on from there. I did a Google search, which actually turned up a wealth of information. In relative terms, as the internet as a whole was not as well developed in 2007 as it is today, from those who had similar experiences. I found references to callers on Coast to Coast AM reporting seeing shadow men while in transitionary sleeping to waking states, and the appearances being paired with the feelings of intense fear and inability to move. The phenomenon is called sleep paralysis and is very well documented, though the initial experiences were severely disquieting, and I cannot emphasize this enough.
I felt better having a reasonable explanation for it. In my opinion, what makes this so upsetting for so many people around the world is that it is a variation on the classic human fear of home invasion, and the imagery lends itself to supernatural explanations. After this first experience during young adulthood, I would have many more over the years of my life, continuing into adulthood. The nature of shadow people is ever-changing. They were always threatening at first, like the first experience that I had in the college apartment, until I fully accepted that I would be visited by them during the night at random times. They seemed to want to invent new ways to surprise me. In a way, the shadow people are kind of like real people, because their own motivations and behaviors vary so wildly. They emerge from the shadows on my walls or any area of the room, though they seem to prefer my closet. I try to never sleep facing away from my closet because of this. They can look like men, women, or children of all ages, and can be single or multiple. However, they are always only black silhouettes with no distinct features. The historical majority are entirely human, but some appear to be humanoid creatures. Some wear clothing, but others do not. They may present different body language, depending on their personality. Things that the shadow people don't do include making sound and interacting with physical objects, including touching me in the room. Strangely, whenever they are present, I get the feeling that they cannot touch or otherwise directly interact with me because I know that they are not real. I have no idea what it would feel like to be touched by one of them, but I do know that I would never want to find out. The shadow people don't seem to acknowledge the concept of personal space, and would just as soon stand anywhere in the room as inches from my face. They usually observe me, and will sometimes attempt interaction. When multiple shadow people are present, they are able to sense interact with each other. The majority of the shadow people that I experience are, for lack of a better term, telepathic. They are able to project feelings and narratives into my mind, along with forcing me to feel their presence. Thus, I am able to understand their motivations, even though they cannot speak to me, and to know when they are in my bedroom relative to me, even when I can't see them. The feelings and narratives can be anything from, I am only here to observe you, to, I don't really want or need to be here, to, I enjoy making you feel threatened. They can be curious, shy, funny, friendly, mischievous, or even unaware of me altogether. The majority are benign in the sense that they have no malicious intent. However, the telepathy can be extremely disturbing when a shadow person does have the malicious intent, as it will project feelings of terror and doom into my mind. As typical as some behaviors are of types of shadow people, some people just don't seem to follow the established rules. These are just examples of unique ones that I have experienced. One non-human creature, similar to a combination of a dog/human or a werewolf. It sat on the edge of my bed, just past my left leg, with a hostile, hunched-over body posture that animals make when they think that you're a threat. A taller, angular adult male with limbs and fingers too long, and several accompanying children. It signaled that they were the only there to briefly observe me, and that they didn't mean to disturb me. Very polite and non-hostile. Appeared from and disappeared back into my closet. It was almost like a school teacher with students on a field trip. A slender young woman in the flowing gown with arms that ended in asymmetrical claws, resembling tree branches, and a head like a combination of a dog's and a human's. She stood with the hunched posture, mostly still near the foot of my bed, but I could tell from her telepathic broadcast that she was waiting for me to look away, and that she wanted to harm me somehow. She thought of herself as some kind of huntress. During the fall of 2016, I had a new development. I began hearing loud noises while waking up, like gunshots, rumbling, metallic banging, roaring, human screams, or doors opening and slamming. Having already experienced the shadow people for something like a decade, my first thought was something along the lines of, well, it looks like these little butts are up to new tricks. Oh well, nothing new. After this happened a few times, I Googled and found exploding head syndrome, which perfectly describes what I experience and is even known to have an overlap with those who experience sleep paralysis. I don't know why it took so damn long for my brain to start thinking that it hears these things, but I'm not really surprised by it at all. As I've said above, the hallucinations during my waking-sleeping transitions are ever-changing. Then, after the development of sound, things took a turn for the weird, dark, and scary. During a fairly recent sleep paralysis incident in the winter of 2016, I was visited by what I can only describe as a shadow person in the form of a disembodied voice. I was sleeping on my left side, facing towards my bedroom window and away from my closet. The darker part of my room and my closet was over my right shoulder. As I was transitioning to wakefulness, I felt that familiar presence of a shadow person, but was surprised by the amount of hatred that it projected for me. It was very specific and personal. I sensed the presence coming closer in my bedroom, to the point of being just over my right shoulder and ear. Of course, as in all cases, I was in that state of paralysis, and thus was unable to turn to look to see the form of the shadow person. I got the feeling that this shadow person was unhappy with me, unhappy with being in my room, and wanting to physically harm me despite being unable to do so. Typical. But then, to my absolute shock, amazement and terror, the shadow person began speaking to me. The voice was my own, but forced into a low growl, saturated with pure hate. It was extremely verbally abusive, saying things like, "If you don't think I'm real, why don't you turn over and look at me? You're a coward, a liar, and you lie to yourself about us. Why are you surprised? You didn't think that we could talk to you. You're stupid and pathetic. You think you've accepted us, but you know nothing about us." Per the usual, I jolted awake and screamed things back at the presence, which had by then vacated. I was just so shocked that a shadow person had spoken to me, and that it had done so in such an abusive way, that it was almost like going through the experience of initial exposure all over again. To say the least, this incident seriously disturbed me, and led me beginning to write what you read now. During this, I never visually saw what this speaking shadow person looked like, and I'm glad for that. Speaking shadow person being a product of my mind, if you're still in my subconscious somewhere and can read what I'm typing, go screw yourself. As I wrote the majority of all the above, problems began to develop. Thinking and writing about my history with these experiences for a few days in a row, during February of 2017, triggered the EHS and the shadow people hallucinations often, and I was woken up several times per night by them. This went on for about a week or so, and became increasingly disruptive. Then I set into motion the worst shadow person incident that I have ever experienced when I made the mistake of discussing the writing of the story with my online gaming clan on our VOIP channel. I discussed them at length, and especially in the aspect that thinking about them directly correlated with the frequency of their appearances. I then wondered aloud about why the shadow people could not touch me when they cannot affect my other senses, such as sight and sound. That very same night, I fell asleep in my bed on my stomach after getting kind of drunk. As I was beginning to wake and entered the familiar state of paralysis, I heard a series of door-slamming noises and footsteps approaching my room. Even though I couldn't see, I sensed the presence of a shadow person, a young adult woman with malicious intent. She entered the bedroom, and to my horror, surprise approached the bed and climbed on top of my back in an unwelcome and uncomfortable way. I was shocked to feel a sensation of her knees resting on my shoulder blades and her weight pressing down on me. Her skin felt like human skin. I'm not sure what I would have expected, and still not sure what to make of this. Bending down over me, she whispered taunting things into my ear from behind me and repeatedly laughed at me. She said things like, "I am here. We are all still here. Your mind is not your own. You are ours to torment." Her laughter wasn't jovial or friendly at all, but icy. After waking up from this disturbing experience, it was at that point that I realized that I was uncomfortable continuing to write about this aspect of my history, because thinking about it so much was actively causing more intense and disturbing hallucinations with malicious tones. So I stopped. I think it took about a month for me to revisit and complete this. This brings us to the present time, I haven't really seen many shadow people since the incident with the last speaking, touching woman, and certainly none as unique as her or other malicious speaking hallucinations. I now believe that thinking about these additional abilities of speech and touch may have in turn given my brain the idea to include those abilities in the hallucinations. I've been up for about 4 hours longer than I should have writing this through the night. I'm going to take a nap before work, and I'll sure as hell sleep on my back. When I was little, I used to see shadow people. I used to sleep in my mom's bedroom as a child, and obviously, I went to bed before the rest of my family because I was so young. On one particular night, my parents tucked me into bed and left a light on for me and left the door open so that I wouldn't get scared. When they left, I saw what looked like a bunch of human shadows by the TV. I looked at them for a little while and they seemed to be moving, like they were walking on a city street. Being 6 years old, I got scared and hid under my covers and quickly went to sleep after that. I don't remember seeing them again in my mom's bedroom, but I do remember seeing them just out of the corner of my eye. I told my parents and they just thought it was just my imagination or my mind playing tricks on me. I'm still adamant to this day that I saw shadow people and even individuals who would stay in my room for a little while, as if they were watching me and then leave. I don't see them anymore, and I don't know if I'll ever see them again. August 24th, 2019. It's been almost 3 weeks since my father received his cancer diagnosis. It's a bright, sunny Saturday morning, and there's plenty to do around the house. So I put my earbuds on, selected a playlist from my iPhone, picked up the weed trimmer, and walked to the far corner of our 3-acre lot. It's your typical new suburban home in Central Florida. Lightly painted stucco walls with 2 to 3 understory trees and St. Augustine grass lawn. The mission for the day is to clear about 2 feet off the property line of any St. Augustine grass to continue planting hedges. I'm trimming away when, all of a sudden, out of the corner of my eye, I see a black spot, almost like a black sheet that someone has hung to dry off the side of the house. The flickering black is so deep that you can almost see green, purple, blue hues. As quickly as it came, it disappeared. This happened multiple times all throughout the morning. In total, I must have seen this spot 4 to 5 times. What has started out as a larger black flickering sheet would turn out more refined every time I saw it, always out of the corner of my eye. Last I saw it for the day, it would have been around noon, and by then, a more slender, human-like figure was present from the shoulders up, with sort of a foggy, undefined bottom. Not being a big believer and almost an atheist, I convinced myself that it was stress or too much brightness outside and went on about my day as if nothing had happened. August 25th, 2019. I visit my parents' house. They live about 5 miles down the road from us. They had moved into their new home only a couple of months prior. Spent most of the day just hanging out. I'm driving back home, thinking of all the things I must do at work Monday morning. I'm driving, but I'm a bit unfocused, kind of daydreaming, numb from all the things our family is going through, and worried how the next couple of months will turn out with my dad's disease. Come to the one and only stop sign between our places. Brake, look left, look right, hit the gas. Out of thin air, a shadow appears right in front of the car. I didn't quite see it fully. The reflex was to immediately hit the brakes again, mid-intersection. Just as it came, it was gone. This time, I shared with what I saw with my partner, only to receive a call from my mom a few hours later. Dad is not doing well, and he's being rushed to the hospital. August 26, 2019. Dad unexpectedly passes. I said his death was unexpected because, even with a cancer diagnosis, he was doing quite well. He had just started his treatment, and for the first time since his 3-week-old diagnosis, we thought we would have him around for another year or so. What exactly did I see? Why at my house and not at theirs? Granted, my parents had lived with us from December to May while their home was being built. In the midst of all the grief, I started to look for answers as to what I experienced. Seems to be some form of shadow people. I believe they came to warn or to guide him to the afterlife. Anyway, just wanted to share my experience and see if anyone else has similar ones. I'll preface this by saying that my wife is 100% a skeptic. She is a very rational, scientific person and chooses to believe in what is proven and what she can quantify. But I will say, I think that's in part because she doesn't like being scared. She doesn't like scary movies and she dismisses the idea of ghosts or other cryptids. That being said, a few weeks ago, she woke me up at 3 a.m. saying that she 100% saw someone in our house, that our animals were spooked, and she asked me to search the house. I got my gun from my nightstand and searched the house and checked the doors and windows, and finding no one, to return to bed, where we discussed what she saw. She says that she woke up and saw the figure of a man walking out of our bedroom door. She even heard the floorboards creak as it walked out. But all of our animals were either on the bed with us or sleeping next to it. Since then, she's seen it almost every night, either leaning into the doorway with a hand on the door frame, or fully in the room, standing at the foot of the bed. She attempts to rationalize it, and eventually falls back asleep, which I hear is common with these kinds of scenarios. The worst one was a few nights ago, where she had a terrible dream where I left for work, and she felt the creature get into bed with her and put its arm over her as though it was attempting to cuddle. Even skeptics have their limits, and she doesn't want to talk about it because it's frightening her, and it's not something she could just rationalize anymore. Is there anything I can do to help put her mind at ease? From everything I've read, they very rarely cause any kind of physical harm, but I'm worried that this might do her mentally. We have a 10-month-old son, and she works nights, so her on and off days she's forced to maintain normal day hours and has trouble sleeping through the night because she's normally awake then. I've always felt I've had this sight since a child. There's a room in my grandmother's house called the Red Eye Room. Apparently, my family has been calling it that for years because a being with red eyes will climb on top of you while sleeping and stare at you. I had this happen and felt and saw the bed sag from the weight, and all I could do was scream. Fast forward to now, I'm 25. I woke up out of a dead sleep, and I see red eyes reaching towards me with a beaming smile, and before he reaches me, I scream, and he evaporates. I ran out of my house. I believe he may be in my closet, as funny as that sounds, but I see my hangers move sometimes, and nothing could be disturbing them but an outside force. Not sure if it's menacing, but it's never spoken to me or made a noise. Just watched me. I guess I don't remember exactly when I started seeing a tall, skinny black figure, but it has been happening on and off for years now. I didn't know it was abnormal. I went to a meditation retreat 2 years ago, and on the 4th day, I was terrified to close my eyes because whenever I did, multiple black figures with yellow glowing eyes would propel themselves towards me, and I would open my eyes right before they reached my face. I couldn't sleep at night because I was terrified they would come, and they did when the lights were off, even with my eyes open. During the meditation sessions, I would just sit there with my eyes open and silently cry, safely in a room full of 80 other people. I was scared for my life within my own mind, but also transferring to the physical. I was scared, confused, and terrified. I requested to talk to the leader or whatever, because we could ask questions for 5 minutes. I told him about it, and he said that all I needed to do was to keep my eyes shut while they came at me and let it happen. Face them, let them take over, and accept them. I went back and did that, and I had to force myself to squeeze my eyes tight and to not open them. It was absolutely terrifying, but they did not come back for the rest of the retreat, and I was able to sleep and meditate. I started seeing a tall figure again this winter. It appears out of the corner of my eye, and when I look, it slides away. When it happens during the day, I am scared but feel safer. But when it happens at night, I'm terrified. I either sit as still as I can or hold my breath and run to my room. The place I live has a lot of sharp corners going into different rooms, so that makes it way worse than even running away.